Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
My brother Teddy died on December 11th, 1999, during our annual family Christmas party. He was 12 and I was 9. I wish I could say it wasn't my fault, but at the end of the day, the whole thing had been my idea. I'm from Woodbury, Minnesota, as is my entire extended family. Every Christmas, my parents would host a holiday party to eat, drink, and gossip. It was always a boring event, but I loved seeing all my cousins. The adults usually stuck us kids in the basement or the loft, but that year my brother convinced them to let us go sledding at the park instead. We bundled up in our purple Vikings parkas and loaded up the sleds with blankets and our pockets with hand warmer packets. Then me, my brother, and our cousins Mike and Jeff set off for the sledding hill, which is about half a mile down the road. As soon as we were out of view of the house, Teddy stopped. "You guys want to do something fun?" he asked. "Hell yeah! Of course!" "I want to go sledding," I muttered. "Yeah, well, sledding is for babies," said Jeff. "That's what I was thinking too," his brother added. Teddy smiled. "Good, because I want to take you guys somewhere way more awesome." "Where are we going?" I asked nervously. "Mom and Dad will get mad if they look for us in the park and we're not there." "They won't look. They're too drunk," Teddy laughed. "But—" "I think we should go to Rocking Horse Creek," he added coolly. Rocking Horse Creek was actually more of a small river than a creek, but it had been called that for as long as I can remember. The creek had been named by neighborhood kids who'd found an almost life-size rocking horse sitting abandoned and half submerged in the water. No one knew where it had come from, just as no one knew the actual name of the river, because no one had ever been stupid enough to tell their parents that they went there. "But Rocking Horse Creek is almost an hour walk from here," I whined. I was already cold and didn't feel like walking that far. Mike snorted. "Don't be a baby. There's extra blankets if you're cold, plus hand warmer packets in your pockets." "Yeah," Jeff added, "and if you want, we can pull you along in the sled just like the baby you are." Mike and Jeff laughed, but Teddy didn't, and he punched Jeff in the arm. "Stop it, you guys. I'm not a baby. And why go to the creek anyway? It's probably ice." "Because it'll look hella cool," Teddy said. "Yeah, I want to go," said Mike. "We could tie our jacket string to some sticks and go ice fishing." "Yeah!" "Well, I'm really good at ice fishing," I lied. "So I have to go so I can help you." "Sure you are," Jeff rolled his eyes. The walk didn't take an hour. It was more like 35 minutes, though it did feel longer due to the cold. When we approached, we saw that the river was indeed frozen over. The ice looked several feet thick, though it was hard to tell. Jeff and Mike were really excited about it and kept testing their weight on the thinner ice of the riverbank. I sat down on my sled and drew a couple blankets around me. "I'm smaller than them, so I'm colder," I justified to myself. Ted, Mike, and Jeff stood on the riverbank and threw rocks onto the ice to see if they could break it. When they failed to produce even the smallest crack, Jeff announced it was time to play Ricochet Dare. I hated Ricochet Dare. As soon as Jeff suggested it, I felt a cold stone drop into the pit of my stomach. Ricochet Dare was something we'd been playing since we were little kids. The rules stated that if you were dared to do something and you didn't do it, the game would end and you would be the new wuss. And this ridicule would go on for weeks or even months. However, if you did do it, then you got to dare someone in return. Generally, the dares start off mild, but with every round the stakes get higher. The game would only end when someone inevitably wussed out. And of course, that person was usually me. But not this time, I thought as I shrugged off the blankets and I stood up, pushing my hat up from my eyes. I had to redeem myself and make Teddy proud. I had to show them I wasn't a baby. "Come on," Jeff yelled at me. You go first." "Okay. What's the dare?" I asked with false bravado. Jeff said. "Okay. You have to take 3 steps out onto the ice." I eyed the frozen river warily. 3 steps? "Yep. And not baby steps. Real steps." "Stop it! I'm not a baby!" "Then prove it." I took my first step lightly and paid close attention to the give of the slippery mass beneath me. There was none that I could feel, and the ice made no sound of protest underneath my feet. I took the 2 last steps quickly, and then turned around and half-skated back to shore. My brother gave me a huge smile and a high five. I dared Mike to take 4.5 steps. Mike dared Ted to do 6 steps. And Ted dared Jeff to do 10 steps. And then Jeff dared me to walk all the way to the opposite shore. The ice hadn't made a sound since we had started the game, instead remaining as silent as death. Still, there was something unsettling stringing through the cold air and the silence. I stalled for as long as I could, trying to decide if I should complain. Jeff's dare was actually 2 dares, and I didn't think that was fair. Technically, I would have to do it twice, once to get to the opposite shore and once to get back. I was afraid of falling through to the cold water I knew was raging by under the ice. "Come on, don't be a baby, just do it," Mike said.
"Little baby wavy afraid of the icy-wicy?"
Jeff mocked. "Stop it, you guys, I'm not a baby. This dare isn't fair, it's 2 dares." My voice was drowned out by Jeff and Mike's mock baby cries. I looked at Teddy for help, but he was laughing. Laughing. My older brother didn't even attempt to stick up for me. He was joining in with them. I felt my lower lip wobble and tears fill my eyes. "Don't cry. Babies cry. You're not a baby." I jerked my head back to the river so they couldn't see my red face and traitorous tears. I felt a sob begin to bubble up through my throat, and I knew I couldn't let them hear it. I would die before I'd let them see me cry. I took a deep breath and ran across the ice as fast as I could, and for a moment I actually hoped I did fall through. They would be in so much trouble, and they would feel so sorry that they'd made fun of me and called me a baby. With every slap of my boot, I listened for the telltale sound of cracking ice. But none came, and before I knew it, I was on the other side. I raised my fists in the air triumphantly and waited to hear their cheers. When I turned to look back, they were still standing in a circle together, laughing. They hadn't even been watching me. They missed the entire dare. And I wanted to cry all over again. I swallowed the tears and was about to yell that I wanted to go home. But just then, I noticed something dangling from the tree above them. How had I forgotten? I was the only one who'd noticed it, and I realized it was my ticket to revenge and redemption. But who to dare? I stood silently watching them as they joked with each other and pointed at each of them in return, silently mouthing to myself, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Catch a tiger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." My finger landed on Teddy. Good, I thought. He's supposed to be my brother. He deserves it the most. I cleared my throat. "I dare," I yelled across the small river, interrupting them. They turned to look at me, almost surprised to see me standing on the other shore. So they had forgotten about me. "I dare," I started with renewed anger, "Teddy to rope swing across the creek and land on this side." There was silence as, in tandem, all 3 looked up at the rope hanging from the tree above them. During the summer, we would take turns swinging on it and cannonballing into the water, and if you pushed off the tree hard enough, you could actually make it to the other side of the creek. I'd seen my brother do it many times. Teddy's eyes got wide, and he looked at me as if I'd sentenced him to death. Jeff and Mike immediately started prodding him, telling him not to be a wuss. I smiled smugly from the other side of the river. I hoped he'd fail the dare. It'd be just what he deserved. It didn't take much name-calling for Teddy to climb the tree and grab onto the rope. He tested it a few times, and then hung onto it with all of his weight. It held like it always had. "When I get over there, I'm going to dare you to do jumping jacks in the middle of the creek," he yelled at me. That's when I realized my mistake. If Teddy dared me to do that, I would most certainly wuss out, and then they'd tease me until Easter. I sent a silent prayer up to God that Teddy didn't make it to this side of the river. "On 3, Mike yelled to Teddy. I watched Teddy count silently to himself and then push off from the tree as hard as he could. He swung in a long, deep arc, just like he always did. I watched the scene with my fingers crossed, hoping the rope wouldn't go far enough and that he would have to land back on the other riverbank. His dare unfulfilled, and the game ended. But I could tell immediately that he was going to make it and somberly stepped backward to make room for him to land. And then suddenly, the loudest sound I've ever heard before or since rang through the air like a gunshot. Snap! Teddy broke through as soon as he hit the ice, and the rope and tree branch followed him down into the darkness below. I felt my feet moving under me as I slipped, and I slid my way out to where he'd gone in. All 3 of us were on our bellies, groping into the angry, jagged hole within 10 seconds. We searched the watery void, but all we could feel was a tree branch below. And within a minute, we couldn't feel anything at all. Our hands and arms had gone numb. Jeff pulled Mike and I to our feet and started running for the sleds. "Leave a sled here. We need to get out of here, now!" I felt cold and dead. I stumbled blindly toward the sound of my cousin's voice. We need to save Teddy. I want Teddy. He's in the ice. We have to get Mom and Dad." But I was blubbering so badly by the end that I doubt they understood a word of it. And despite my slurred protests, I followed them through the woods, confused and cold. But after a while, I couldn't feel the cold anymore. I couldn't feel any pain in my heart or my body. In fact, I couldn't feel anything at all. Mike didn't say a word for the entire walk back, but Jeff went on and on about the plan. We would just say that Teddy decided to go home before us and that he had said he was going to take a shortcut through the woods. The other woods on the far side of the road. I just nodded for a while, even smiled at his plan. God, to this day, I don't know why I smiled. We were almost home by the time I began to process what he was saying. "No, I have to tell Dad to save Teddy," I told him. I was surprised by how flat my voice sounded. Mike just kept walking forward in a daze, but Jeff whirled on me. "It's too late to save him, but you can save yourself. It's your fault this happened because it was your dare. They will take you to jail for murder and put you on death row. It's an open and shut case. You can't tell anyone, ever." And I don't know why, but I believed him. The hardest part of the day wasn't watching my brother die, or the long, cold walk home. The hardest part, by far, was pretending like nothing was wrong when we got there. "What do you mean you haven't seen Teddy? He should have been back by now. He started home an hour before us." I couldn't keep my poker face for very long, though, and I started crying. My dad thought it was because I was so cold that my skin had begun to turn white. The adults immediately mounted a search of the woods between our house and the park, which, of course, turned up nothing. By nightfall, they had called the police. Search and Rescue searched the wrong woods for the next 24 hours because they believed our story. The sledding hill had been crowded that day, but a couple of people were sure they'd seen us there. The day after that, they intended to search the other side of the forest, the side Teddy was actually on. But a blizzard rolled in the overnight and the search was called off. My parents were told that wherever Teddy was, he was most certainly dead. Parents in the neighborhood stopped letting their children play in the woods, even in the summer. My own parents wouldn't let me leave the house for a year. I grew up angry and spiteful. I hated everyone, but no one more than myself. I applied to college just to get away from my parents, whose constant love and support felt vile and wrong to me. I wish they would have another kid so they could give their love to someone deserving and stop talking about Teddy all the time. I got into the U of M. My grades sucked and I drank a lot. My parents pressured me to excel since I was their last horse in the race. I never returned their calls or emails. I lived with the guilt. Just barely. But I lived with it. If nothing else, I could take a bit of pride in the fact that I was surviving. Drunkenly one night, I finally told a couple of my close friends about it. They agreed that it wasn't my fault. That shit happens. And that Teddy wouldn't want me to dwell on it. I made the dare, but he climbed the rope. That night was a turning point for me. After being validated by people who actually knew the truth, I cut back on the drinking and I picked up my grades for the last 2 semesters. And somehow, it was enough to graduate. A year later, I got an invitation to an engagement party at my parents' house. Cousin Jeff was getting married to a girl he'd met in the Navy, and I was invited to celebrate their love with them. As much as I always hated going back home, I wanted to support Jeff. Somehow, just knowing that he was living a full life despite our shared burden made me feel hopeful, like I could too. The party was quieter and more reserved than the parties my parents threw when we were kids. They had become less fun since Teddy's death, more refined, more somber. Jeff was quieter than I remembered too, but he was clearly happy with his new fiancée, who seemed like a very nice girl. And though a wide smile was spread across his face, his eyes betrayed a certain guardedness, especially when he looked at me. I got up the courage to talk to him only once. We shared an awkward hug, and I congratulated him on his engagement and asked him about his brother. Jeff told me that Mike was addicted to heroin and living in Arizona somewhere. I said it seemed Mike had never really recovered. Jeff said he didn't know what I was talking about and walked away. I spent the rest of the party hugging relatives, making small talk, and pretending to drink. Sobriety is suspect in my family. After a while, I went outside to take in a cigarette in a moment of peace. And, in the secrecy of the autumn air, I started to cry. This party should be boisterous and loud. My parents should be lively and laughing. Mike should be running around the party daring people to take mystery shots. I should be cheerfully telling stories from college and talking about my plans for graduate school. And Teddy should be here, instead of lying dead at the bottom of a riverbed. I flicked my cigarette under my car and wiped the wetness from my cheeks. I knew what I had to do and where I had to go. I had to see the river that had haunted me since I was 9. Had anyone been back to Rocking Horse Creek? Was Teddy's sled still there? Had they replaced the rope? Had the creek dried up? This was my worst fear. It had secrets I didn't want to live to see revealed. I lit another cigarette as I walked and began to list all the reasons this was a bad idea. I spent the hike either begging myself to find the strength to turn around or begging for the courage to continue on. I arrived at Teddy's grave before I was ready. The creek was loud and the water was moving quickly. Recent rain in the area to blame, no doubt. The rocking horse itself was in bad shape. Only its head was visible above the water now, and it was so rotted you could barely tell what it was anymore. No one had replaced the rope. I sat down next to the creek and took it all in. It was hard to believe that this was the same place from which I still woke up screaming. It seemed to have healed since taking Teddy's life. If it could heal, maybe I could heal too. The tree was so full you wouldn't think it had ever lost a single branch. The creek innocently bubbled by, full of life and vigor. Everything here was so different than I remembered. Even the rocking horse. Where the toy had once been cheerful, almost animated, It was now just a morbid, misshapen head. Its eyes were pointed directly at me, and they bore a soulless stare right through me. It sent an involuntary shudder through my body, and I turned away from the horse's head in revulsion. I immediately saw what the horse had been looking at. A sliver of red plastic jutting out of the ground behind me. Teddy's sled. My reaction was visceral, and I had to lean over and vomit in the grass beside me. It was real. It had happened. Had I been pretending it wasn't real? Was that why I had really come here? To pretend that the past was gone and didn't matter anymore? How could I forget what this place really was? I stumbled to my feet and began walking down the riverbank, away from the buried sled, pausing every few feet to dry heave. I just wanted to get away from it, that thing that was all that remained of my brother. Everything that used to be Teddy lay at the bottom of the river now. I pulled a cigarette from my pack with shaking hands. As I tried to light it, I tripped over something and fell forward, my cigarette rolling down the riverbank and into the water. It was a rope, and I knew right away that it was Teddy's rope. I kicked it away from me. It was worse than the sled. If I had anything left to throw up, I know I would have. The end of the rope lay deteriorating on the riverbank, the length of it disappearing into the murky water of the river. And maybe I am morbid or sick or crazy, but I decided I wanted to know. I wanted to see. I crawled over to it and picked it up. It felt just as it did all those summers ago when I used to swing from it into the water as Teddy clapped from the shoreline. I began to pull the rope out of the river. The water was fast moving and the rope was heavy. The creek didn't want to give up its secrets so easily, and it rebelled against my efforts. Still, I pulled harder. Just as I felt I was coming to the end of it, something long and thin breached the surface of the river. I saw it for only a moment before the rotted rope snapped and it sank back into the dark abyss. I almost dove in after it, but as I stood on the riverbank, my brain screaming at me, I realized what I'd almost done. What if that was Teddy? Would I want to see? Breaking from my trance, I hurled the rest of the rope into the water and fled into the woods. My lungs struggled to draw breath, and the trees began to spin around me. I anxiously lit yet another cigarette and let the shudders rack through my body as I waited for the nicotine to calm me. I stood there, in the middle of the woods, the broken rope 20 feet behind me at the bottom of the river, and took short drags off of my cigarette. And when my breathing had become bearable again, I felt someone watching me. It was Teddy, of course. He sat with his back against a tree, faded purple parka, still bright in the mid-afternoon sun, and in some parts bleached almost as white as his bones. Ripped foil from an open hand-warmer packet was clutched in his hand, still remaining after all these years. He stared at me accusingly. The deep eye sockets of his skull were somehow not empty. Instead, they held a knowing consciousness that said he knew what we had done. He knew we'd left him to die. But we hadn't known that, Teddy. We hadn't. We didn't know you crawled out of the river. We didn't know you were freezing to death as we ran home to bury our secrets. We would have saved you, Teddy, if we had known. You know that. We had blankets and sleds. If we'd known you'd crawled from the river, we would have saved you. I yelled this at the skeleton, in my head or out loud, I'm not entirely sure. But Teddy just sits there, staring at me, 30 yards from the rocking horse, 20 yards from the broken tree. And I know he'll sit here forever. Because Jeff and Mike don't need to know that our sins are more terrible than we'd ever thought. I know it is my burden to bear. And I can tell as he watches me in the fading sunlight that Teddy agrees.
My name is Russell Green. At dawn on the morning of June 14th this year, I set off in a rented boat to a spot 11 miles north of Oimer, on Russia's Lake Baikal. My destination was informally called the Pit of Night. 3 years ago, a giant sinkhole formed spontaneously at that spot, 3,500 feet below the lake's surface, making the lake even deeper in that area. The Pit of Night, less than a half-mile across, could only be detected remotely as it formed. Seen on computers as a nebulous disturbance, it took experts months to define. Geologists believe the sinkhole may have been set off by deep drilling on the shore near Popova during construction of a plant that would make cardboard, but they couldn't be certain. Also unknown was the exact depth of the Pit of Night, because divers of course weren't able to plummet to any extent. The water pressure became unendurable at only 1,000 feet. Echo sounders, combined with cold water temperature in that area, pointed to the possibility that the sinkhole was of a depth that may have made the spot match the deepest point of the deepest lake in the world, which is Lake Baikal itself. That would mean the bottom point was more than 5,000 feet below the surface. I had the idea to boat out to the Pit of Night as a way to unofficially end a 3-week solo trip through Mongolia that I had taken on assignment from the Tandem Regional Times, based in Ontario. The idea was to drive in from my hotel in Irkutsk and go out to the spot and have a swim just to say I did it, mark it on some interior bulletin board of minor outdoorsy accomplishments. I didn't think there would be anything out there of interest to readers, really. The rental service must have become overly impressed with my ties to the press because they were willing to give me way more boat than I needed for no extra money. A 70-foot former shrimper that had been converted into a research vessel and hadn't seen any action for a while. It was pretty decrepit at least, which was what I was used to. The Pit of Night was a couple of miles beyond the furthest point of tourist travel on that part of the lake, so I expected to be all alone at that hour of the morning. It wasn't quite light when I set out. By the time I had to start thinking about seriously plotting my position, it was full dawn, but totally sunless and foggy. The horizon and the sky merged in a gray, ghostly haze, and it was impossible to tell where one began and the other ended. The lake was calm, just barely warm enough to have a brief swim in my thermally insulated wetsuit when I got to the right spot. I saw exactly one other boat as I went, a Viking 5-star owned by someone rich or one of the charter companies. It had been more than a year since the incident that had cemented the sinkhole's nickname. I'm talking, of course, about the disappearance of the Bierbachelor sisters, the German outdoor adventurers in their 20s who were as famous for their fashion model looks as their mountain climbing and deep-sea diving exploits, and who didn't mind trading off those looks to secure further funding for their travels. But above all, they were experienced, intelligent explorers. They blogged about crossing the Pit of Night on their way northeast in late June last year during a photography trip, and 16 hours after they embarked from Oimer, the search for their vessel began. Yet nothing was ever found. Not bodies, not the boat, not the slightest sliver of wreckage. The Bierbachelor sisters had simply disappeared. That was all it took to create the beginnings of a legend about the sinkhole and what it might be hiding. It was tough to forget the last picture they took together as they climbed aboard their boat and headed off, smiling at the camera. The likeliest scenario was that they had gotten caught in a squall and the boat sank. Lake Baikal's sheer size made it incredibly difficult to pinpoint their route and dive for wreckage with any real precision. There were whispers that an abduction was possible, a kidnapping, piracy, but no evidence had been found of this. It remained a mystery. Consulting my GPS, I closed in on the sinkhole right on my informal schedule, putting along quietly at 12 knots, feeling more and more alone, though God knows that was a feeling I was completely used to, doing what I did for a living. Even I, though, had my own interior tears of solitude, and that murky, oppressive sky and the barren emptiness of Lake Baikal all around me depressed my mood. I found myself looking forward to the plane ride home. I'm not sure exactly when I killed the boat's engine because I was more or less on the pit's center point. Visually, of course, I saw nothing different. From my vantage point, the lake looked just the same. I sat and put on my wetsuit and snapped a couple of pictures of myself smiling, and then I dove over the side of the boat into the cold water. It was so cold, I let out a little yelp going in, but I had experienced worse. I took a couple of leisurely laps around the boat, then treaded water for a time. Then, for posterity, I closed my eyes and let myself simply sink. My arms over my head, descending into the deep naturally, allowing myself the fantasy that I was actually lowering myself into the pit of night itself. The pit's gaping mouth was 3,500 feet below me unseen, but at least I could say I gave it a chance to suck me in forever, to claim me, but it never did. Just a few seconds into my descent, I reached a state of zen-like calm and was able to feel an appreciation on an elemental level for where I was, the awesome natural scope of it. I opened my eyes and saw only darkness. I had just about reached my dive limit and was ready to stop myself and swim back up to the surface for a breath, when my legs began to be lifted gently by a push of water from beneath me, as if a current were coming from below. The water felt no warmer or colder. My legs went up until I was horizontal in the dark, and I could hear the low moan of a large body of water shifting, reorganizing, and I freaked out a little, frightened of what might happen to me depending on the size of that current. I began to swim upwards quickly, but the current became quickly stronger than I, and it turned me completely over. I popped up above the surface in a bit of a panic, but I regained control again quickly. The surface of the lake was still calm. Only when I was comfortably treading water again did it become just a little choppier where I was. I was maybe 27 feet from the boat, and I swam toward it with some haste. There was no telling where that rush of water had gone to, or how big it had been. The only other time in my life I'd felt something like that had been when I was swimming in the Sea of Cortez, and the blue whale had passed me from below. The whale wasn't more than 10 feet from me, but there was nothing that size in Lake Baikal, which was strictly a freshwater lake despite its 12,000 square mile size. I'd read that the creation of the sinkhole may have created powerful vents, but I'd never read any accounts of them. The old fishing boat rocked very gently as I grasped the ladder and slung over its port side and climbed back up. I turned and looked at the spot I swam from. There was nothing there of any note. I had my adventure, and after I changed out of my wetsuit, I'd head back to the shore. I wondered if the Bierbachelor sisters had maybe encountered the results of a vent, as some believe, and how strong it might have been. But even if they had, that might have merely wrecked their boat, but it wouldn't have swallowed it, unless whirlpools could be created over the pit of night. I had heard of phenomena like that. I entered the open cabin, changed out of my wetsuit and into a sweatshirt and jeans after toweling off. I remained in my bare feet. I took 2 more pictures, both of the dreary gray horizon. Visibility remained very poor. It was a little unsettling not to be able to pinpoint where the horizon truly began because of the blurred focus effect the humidity was causing out there. At the point where the surface of the lake disappeared into nothingness so far out, I could see a slight disturbance. Very small waves were forming now, rolling in toward me. The kind of waves generated by a large craft, but I saw and heard nothing out there. It was more likely that the weather was not quite what I thought it would be. I had absolutely no indication that there would be the slightest meteorological disturbance in the area of the pit. The forecast had been for no sun, but certainly nothing above a 2 on the Beaufort wind scale. But the climate could be strange, and it was best I was leaving now. The boat began to rock gently. The waves seemed to double in size very quickly, but still no hint of wind. I thought something beyond the horizon was creating those waves. I was momentarily unbalanced as the lake's icy water slapped against the boat. Looking east and west, I saw that this was a very localized disturbance, as the surface was strangely calm, only 100 yards away. I moved into the cabin to be more secure. I would start the engine as soon as the boat was stable. I peered through the port side window, stabilizing myself against the ledge in front of me. The waves were getting smaller already, and the surface of the water was settling. I emerged from the cabin, closed my eyes, and listened. No engines, no horns, just the low hush of the black water. Then came a sound I've tried to describe many times, and always felt I failed to. I've heard many sounds of whales as recorded deep under the surface of the ocean, and this was like someone had slowed a recording like that, deepened its pitch. It rose from nothing, just barely audible, and demanded that I remain perfectly still and focused to hear it throughout its duration. It reached a sustained moan and seemed to come from behind dozens of unseen stone doors separated by miles of lightless watery deep. "15, 20 seconds, then gone, dissipating like mist in every direction and no direction, though I felt the source was far beneath me, not out there somewhere on the lake. No creature in these waters could have ever made a sound that full, that echoing, and I had the terrifying thought that maybe that was what the sinkhole's creation had sounded like thousands of feet beneath the waves, and there had now been another destabilization which was opening it even further, creating a suction which would take me down forever. By now the boat had drifted to a point I guessed was on the southern edge of the pit of night. I started the engine. It kicked grudgingly into life. I had the presence of mind to cue up my smartphone's voice recorder just in case that sound came again, though I might not even hear it over the sound of the engine. I turned the boat back toward the south, swinging around in an arc wider than I needed, so I could get a better look at my surroundings. Every direction looked the same. I had to rely on the GPS to point myself in the right one. So paranoid had I become that I cross-checked its hint with the compass on my key ring. I headed back slowly because I didn't want the sound of the engine to blot out everything else. I was content to put along that way for a while, replaying that sound I had heard in my mind again and again. It was truly not different enough from things I had heard in nature in my years of traveling to be something to be feared, but I feared it all the same. I turned and looked behind the boat, and I imagined a brief glimpse of the beer bachelor sisters standing near the stern. The color leached from their flesh by days and days beneath the lake, their location missed again and again by hopeless rescue vessels. I snapped myself out of that quickly. I focused on the tiny GPS display so I wouldn't have to think so much, and when I was about a mile past the pit of night, I opened up the engine more to get up to a speed I felt better about. For about 5 minutes I plowed forward, hearing nothing over the engine, feeling a humid breeze created entirely by my motion. Occasional raindrops struck the window in front of me, nothing to worry about. The way ahead was foggy, unclear, but that didn't really matter now. My only concern a few minutes from now would be a boat emerging too quickly up ahead. I'd estimate that I had my attention fixed totally forward for a total of 8 minutes before I turned around that second time to look back. Maybe I sensed something, but I certainly hadn't heard it. About 150 yards behind me, just at the point where visibility became washed out, some enormous thing was disappearing beneath the waves. When I had turned, it had been in the act of descending, so that I only saw the end of its rapid motion and wasn't able to accurately judge the size of what I'd seen. I could only see that it had been a dark gray mass, jagged and contoured as if a gigantic rocket poked up from below and then swiftly vanished again in reaction to outside forces. Maybe 15 feet of it had protruded, and for no more than a couple of seconds. From that point where it sank under the waves, whitecaps rolled outwards, fairly big ones. Whatever had gone below hard, and it was big enough to create a tidal shockwave a little bigger than the one I'd experienced before. I killed the motor at once without thinking, compelled to move toward the stern to get even a few feet closer to the site. As the boat drifted, the disturbance created by the thing 150 yards away settled fast, leaving just emptiness. That could only have been a whale, I thought to myself, which was impossible. They couldn't have come from a saltwater source to Lake Baikal. And it just seemed like it had been too big. The whitecaps it made too prominent. I took my camera out and pointed it at the bleak horizon and waited. I was scared then. My hands were shaking. I remember it clearly. If nothing happened in 30 seconds, I would retreat and get the boat moving forward again. Slowly, maybe, on the off chance that I could snap a photograph of some amazing phenomenon. The seconds ticked away. The water stayed undisturbed, the last of the real waves passing the boat. My eyes darted from spot to spot, searching for any irregularity on the surface of the lake. Come on, I thought. Come on. Come on. What were you? The boat was rocking just a little more than normal, the water around it on all sides choppier than it had been. Then there was a terrific jolt that threw me off balance, almost as if I'd struck a sandbar, and the boat's very gentle forward motion simply stopped. It wasn't moving at all suddenly. Out here, miles from the nearest landmass, I was freakishly anchored, held by something that wasn't letting me go forward, back, or sideways. My heart was hammering. The thought of sending a distress signal rose immediately in my mind as I tried to imagine what had gripped the boat. I edged closer to the starboard side, keeping my center of gravity very low in case another jolt, and looked over. The lake was infuriatingly black and secretive. As if to mock me, a single gull appeared from the east and settled on the dirty stern of the boat. Its tiny eyes seeming to fix right on me. Water suddenly flew up, and from just beyond the stern in an erupting spray, a giant, pale, hook-like object the size of a man whipped from beneath the surface of the water and curled over the edge of the boat. The gull disappeared under its bulk. The hook thing smashed into the planks and drove deep into them, snapping them clean. As it withdrew, it ripped the boards with it and crashed through wood, fiberglass, and steel, smashing a gap there, pieces of the boat splintering and flying into the lake. The entire boat tilted upwards, and I grabbed the railing beside me to hold on. The visibly organic thing went below again after scraping a massive section of the stern away in a second and a half, and the boat settled uneasily, rocking left and right. I remember just standing there for a moment when my balance was secure, inert, numb with the kind of shock people must feel after seeing a car accident or being told their wife had suddenly died somewhere far away. Then my reflexes sent me back into the cabin to gun the engine even before I could survey just how bad the damage was. My only thought was to get away as fast as I could. As soon as the motor was going and the boat was moving forward, I stepped away from the wheel and saw that I was not going to make it back to shore. The bow of the boat was angled dangerously high, and it was cantering to the left because of the imbalance created by the damage. Water was freely lapping over the stern and sloshing into the hole left by the hook thing, more and more every second. The water was weighing the back down, making it too heavy. I would eventually turn over, I thought. It was only a matter of time, so I pushed the engine hard. Unable to keep the boat on a straight line, having to turn it against the momentum that imbalance was generating, the engine would blow out first, probably, destroyed by the lake water. The radio was in perfect working order. With the touch of one button, I sent my GPS coordinates to the Russian border guard, but locating an open channel through a gauntlet of static was the problem. There was a life jacket beside my head, and I tore it free from its hook and got it on as I frantically tried to stabilize both the boat and myself. I was never able to connect to a live person in the border guard before I had to abandon the radio. My coordinates and cry of Mayday would have to do. My attention was divided evenly between the way ahead and the way behind. Nothing was chasing me except time. It became difficult to even stand because the bow was cantering upward more and more. This is it, I thought. I'm going down into the lake. There was a horrible industrial choking sound as the engine gave. That ended in a terrifying silence. The boat carried forward with whatever momentum it had left, veering off to the east, getting me not much further toward the invisible shore. There was no point in waiting for it to go down. The incline would soon be too great for me to stay upright at all. I made my way out of the cabin in quick small maneuvers, hanging on to whatever I could. There was no time to get my wetsuit on. Fearing I was going to my death, I leapt over the side of the boat into the frigid water and watched the boat drift pathetically on, leaving splinters and shards and debris behind it. As I tread water, it got closer and closer to the disappearing point in the gray shroud all around me, and then moved into it just as it began to turn over onto its port side. And so I never saw it go fully down. It became a ghost. I tried to get my breathing under control so as not to go into total shock. I tilted my head to the sky because the blankness up there allowed me to focus on staying calm. My only hope would be to stay sane and swim, but it would take me another 2 full minutes for my brain to send me the proper signal to really move. Panic had me completely. And now, to my utter horror, my sense of direction had been destroyed. All directions still looked the same under that sky. I tried to visualize the path of the boat before and after it had been struck, but was unable to calculate anything clearly. My course, useless as it would be a guess, probably not even improving my chances of discovery by another boat or a rescue vessel by 1%. And so, I chose to just swim away from where I believed that weirdly organic seeming hook had emerged from the waves. I wasn't more than 30 yards on my hopeless journey when I heard the boat being struck far beyond the fog. Struck just once, hard, a low crack as if it were being split in two. An echo trailed it. After that first brutal contact, whatever had smashed into it did not initiate contact with it again. When I heard that, I let myself drift. I am ashamed at how that broke my spirit. Ashamed my survival mechanism withered so fast. The part of my brain that should have been telling me to think rationally instead told me there was something in the lake that would find me soon enough, or hypothermia would claim me in another few hours. There was no cause to struggle. My chances were as good as letting myself go limp as they were fighting to cover meaningless yards. Years ago, I was taught a trick by a man who had almost died in a snowstorm on K2. A trick to remain on an even mental plane in the face of hopelessness. When there's nothing you can do but wait for help, he told me, blot out the visual. Close your eyes and keep them closed. Simplify. Become inert and sightless. And now I could feel that helping me. It was true. Processing the visual all around me, which promised only a terrible end, had to be stopped. I became brutally pragmatic. Sight would not help me in this moment. It would only cause me to overreact, to panic. If I could have kept all sound out, I would have. I heard water moving in a new way somewhere in front of me, very close. It was being displaced by something tremendous, and I was pushed slowly backwards by a sudden current, still limp. It sounded like a waterfall was being born from nothing, and I began to feel spatters of water strike my face from above. My eyes were locked shut, but I sensed the daylight on my face being eclipsed, and the color inside my eyes went from a swamp-like gray to absolute black. As the sound of something mute rising from the lake continued, the spatters became a torrent. Water was descending off this gigantic thing high above me, cascading off it, and I was struck so hard by its force and volume that I went momentarily under, then bobbed back up again as the shower tapered off. I drifted further away from the center point of the great disturbance, sent away by the current. My face to the sky, I clapped my hands over my eyes, relying on my life jacket to just barely keep me afloat. I absolutely would not look. A crackling sound came from above, maybe as far as 100 feet above, something splintering. There was a splash off to my left, then one well behind me, and upon the third one I felt an object strike my right foot, and there was a brief flash of pain. I had so profoundly taken leave of my senses that I didn't realize then that what I was feeling was debris from the boat crashing into the lake. Whatever it was that towered above me became motionless. If it moved toward me, I would die perhaps, but I would not face my killer. Yet there was no motion, as if the thing were waiting for something, or maybe observing me, studying me. I took my hands away from my eyes, and that intense interior darkness beneath the lids remained. It was still there somewhere, blotting out the ghastly sky. It returned to the depths all at once. There was a baritone whooshing sound and then an immense slap against the surface. Water sprayed across me, and then the waves engulfed me and sent me turning over and over. My arms flailed and I tried to stay up, but I became helpless, lost in the rush of tide the thing's descent created. I felt myself drowning, spinning in the darkness, frozen, engulfed by my tomb, frigid, indifferent Lake Baikal, the deepest lake in the world. I did not wish to return to the surface again. Here, down below where everything was and would be mercifully black forever, I opened my eyes as my body rotated gently, having no idea whether I was upside down or sideways or even still in one piece. A face emerged 10 yards in front of me. floating forward just a few inches from a point of nothingness. A face unnaturally, impossibly vivid under the water, and then the rest of a body, also white in perfect contrast to the darkness. The figure of a woman, but this was no corpse. Like a sculpture made of white soap, the woman, once visible, remained perfectly still, like she was standing on an invisible pane of glass, not floating, just standing there. Her hair stayed limp on her shoulders, and where her eyes had been, where her mouth had been, there was just white smoothness. She was holding something in her pale, bony right hand. It was a camera. Then she retreated into the dark without her limbs moving an inch, as if some unseen rope around her waist were retracting, gone back to heaven or hell or the corridors of my subconscious mind. Why not both of the sisters? Why just one of them? Why had it been Gerda, who they called the shy one? The one long tormented by dreams of dying in a plane crash? I next remembered gasping uncontrollably. I had popped up onto the surface and was coughing up blood and water, my lungs spasming painfully. The shock of my body's last desperate attempt to hold on to life forced my eyes open. I was looking directly up at the growing dot of a helicopter coming from the south. My mind and body too wrecked to think, to scream, or raise my arm in a signal. I just watched it. At first, I was convinced that tiny engine sound so far in the distance was moving away from me. But I was wrong. I was back in the exact same helicopter that rescued me 11 hours later, as it flew low and fast over the waves of Lake Baikal, now layered in the shadows of night. The searchlight, when they turned it on 2 miles shy of the pit of night, gave me discolored glimpses of the choppy, secretive surface. No one was talking as we went into a wide, low arc around the search site, the dangerous cold wind making it hard for the pilot to keep us completely steady. Everyone's focus had become quite intense. It was only just and fitting that I would be the one to first lean forward hard against the straps that secured me in point and tell them, There, I see it. There it is.
The Showers by Dylan Sindelar, narrated by Otis Jiry. Part 1. Every area in all parts of the world has those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of the city, a creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts a lonely stretch of road outside of town, there's always a common thread within the tales. No one has ever been to these places, seen the creatures, or witnessed any hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who will proclaim that they know someone whose brother's best friend's sister went to that haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood and snakes and spiders, and is so scary that no one has ever made it all the way through. Those same people will swear by these stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence or a name of someone who could provide proof of the claims, simply because everyone around here knows it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass the tales on to their children, who modify them just enough to keep up with changing times, and the cycle continues. I'm as skeptical as anyone When it comes to these stories, seeing as I was like a junkie when I was younger, constantly searching for more terrifying stories about whatever area of the country I was living in at the time. I made up and spread stories about haunted pizza parlors in New York, my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or how my grandfather encountered a feral, human-like demon creature in the woods of Colorado. I even broke the one rule with these stories by putting myself in them. This took guts in hindsight because I had to make sure that I always told them the same way. Surprisingly, no one ever called my bluff. I like to think that I have had some wonderful contributions to various urban legends around the Midwest and northern states. I moved around a lot. There was always a surge of joy whenever I would wander the halls at school and hear one of my classmates retelling my stories to another, one of their friends, adding a little bit here and there like a massive game of telephone. I knew, of course, that the stories were complete fiction, but I stood my ground whenever someone asked me about them. I would even manage to act a little bit, speaking with a shaky voice or looking scared when I'd recount a situation that I supposedly experienced myself. I suppose this aspect of my childhood has led to my current predicament, which I will recount in full for the internet to take from it what it will. I've laid this little introduction out as sort of a disclaimer, aimed particularly at those who will call my story into question. I have been like the boy who cried wolf for years, but I assure you with every ounce of honesty and integrity that I have that this time the wolf is real. From my introduction, it is probably apparent that I moved around the country quite a bit in my middle and high school years. Neither of my parents had anything to do with any branch of the armed forces. They simply didn't tend to hang around any given place for too long. I suppose it had some sort of effect on me, but I wasn't hurt by it or anything of the sort. Growing up, I was a complete ham. I made friends very easily, was often the class clown, and because of that, was often disliked by my teachers. Again, this was never an issue, as I was usually in another state by the time the next semester rolled around. My friendships were often fleeting, as were any positive relationships that I ever had with my teachers, and because of the events that followed, my memory of one teacher in particular is probably slightly skewed, but I will attempt to give at least biased versions of our friendship that I can. Mr. Mays was one of my social studies teachers in the early years of my high school experience. Being older now, I can understand how horrible children are to deal with around that age, and I respect him to no ends for the way that he was able to connect with his students. He seemed like one of us. He talked like one of us, made pop culture references that were current, listened to cool music, and sometimes he would even say hell or damn while he was giving a passionate lecture about Native American history or something like that. A teacher that swore, even a little bit, was the epitome of cool to a freshman in high school. My memories of Mr. Mays mostly stem from the way that he really got into anything that he was doing. The instance that is still very vivid in my mind was, of course, around Halloween of my sophomore year. Mr. Mays had the typical teacher decorations around the classroom, smiling jack-o'-lanterns and black cat cartoons, typical and boring in the minds of egotistic high school students. However, on the 31st of October, when most other teachers were rolling their eyes at the fact that teenagers still took dressing up in costumes on Halloween seriously, Mr. Mays took the whole cool teacher thing to a new level. We walked into the classroom and were surprised to find the blinds drawn, sheets over the smaller windows, candles lighting the room, and a single frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting on a stool in front of the desks. Mr. Mays sat at his desk, just watching the students come into class and take their seats. He didn't have to ask anyone to be quiet because the moment everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about petty conversations or too confused to bother with them. The students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood and took a seat on a chair right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. "Today's probably my favorite day of the year, class," he said in a monotone voice. "Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I want to share with you exactly why I love it so much." One girl raised her hand with a concerned look on her face. "I'm pushing the due date for your papers to next Tuesday," Mr. Mays said, without bothering to look at the girl, who slowly put her hand down, looking around at the other students with a hint of embarrassment. The class erupted in quiet cheers, and Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story immediately after the class had calmed down. I will attempt to recreate the amazing story that Mr. Mays told the class that day. The way in which he told the story rendered the horror junkies speechless and the rest of the class terrified. The same girl that raised her hand to ask about the paper was holding her knees to her chest by the end of it, a look of terror on her face. The important thing to know was what the story was about. The specifics slip my mind now and aren't too relevant. I'll try to recount the parts of the story that matter the most, but don't hold me to it. Basically, Mr. Mays and his friends set out on a road trip around the country after graduating from college. They took a truck, loaded it with camping gear, and set out to sightsee for the entire summer. The group went from the Poconos in New Jersey down to the coasts of Florida, New Orleans to California, and up to Washington. From there, they went to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and then back home to New York. This concept of the freedom to travel anywhere had the entire class hooked in an instant. Mr. Mays was the coolest teacher ever in my eyes. Being adventurous college kids, the group didn't bring a map. There was no time constraint, so they just kind of drove in the general direction that they wanted to go, and eventually found a town to stay in or someplace that looked interesting. He told us that after spending a week in Colorado, he and his friends had to travel through miles and miles of corn, plains, and more corn. He assumed that they were either in Nebraska or Kansas when they decided to pool their extra cash and stay in a hotel for a night. They settled into a motel in some town that Mr. Mays could barely remember the name of when one of his friends realized that they were somewhere near his grandfather's farm. He wasn't entirely sure where it was, but being adventurous college kids, they decided to get a quick refund from the motel and try to contact the friend's grandpa. They were unable to get a hold of the grandpa on the phone, so the group figured it would be fun to just show up. Mr. May's friend was adamant that his grandparents would take them in and feed them without a moment of hesitation, so the group set out within an hour of sunlight, seeking the salvation of a comfortable house to stay in. In Kansas or Nebraska, wherever it may have been, there aren't a whole lot of natural markers that could guide lost travelers. Any directions given to someone who didn't live around the area basically amounted to, go up a couple of miles to the corn, take a right, and then go down a dirt road to the other corn. There should be some wheat on your right. So, as is the case in most scary stories, the group got lost. Never wanting to admit defeat, they drove into the night, making wrong turns every 5 minutes until they found themselves on a wooded road that Mr. May's friend was certain that his grandparents lived off of. Mr. Mays described the road as basically a dark path to hell. I wasn't exactly sure how true this was because he got very excited and a bit ridiculous with his explanations of the trees that almost tried to grab the car and the red eyes of countless animals looking at them from the darkness. Regardless, the typical horror tropes worked on most of the class. Everyone was terrified. So the group of guys drove on this dark road for about 15 minutes before they came to a clearing and a small building with lights in it, and what seemed to be a silo. They figured that at the very least, the people who lived here would be able to help them find where the guy's grandparents lived. The whole idea of everyone knows everyone in these hick parts of country fueled the hope. They pulled the car up near the building, realizing when they were out of the car that it appeared to be like the kind of place where one would store a whole bunch of chickens, not a home. Still, the lights were on, so they figured they'd give it a try. They approached the building as a group, looking in the semi-open sliding door to find a big, empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights lit the room like it was daytime, and they couldn't see a soul. There were no cars, but one of Mr. May's friends was convinced he'd seen someone as they pulled up, so they decided to go inside and see if there was an office or something where someone might still be working. Why else would they have this huge place lit up like that? There were no doors on the inside of the building. Again, it was just a giant empty hall. So the group roamed around the property and over towards the silo. As they got closer, they noticed what appeared to be a cellar door. At this point, I remember Mr. Mays telling the entire class to learn from his idiocy. He told us that he hadn't seen many horror movies before that time, and didn't think twice about approaching a creepy cellar door in the middle of a dark, scary foreign place. He said that approaching the door was one of his biggest regrets. Mr. Mays let the whole class know that he was going to tell us as much as he deemed appropriate about the experience. He felt that we were mature enough to handle it, but advised anyone that was squeamish to leave the class early. Several students quickly gathered their things and walked out the door, a couple of them being stoners who saw this as an opportunity to smoke behind the school before their next class. I didn't even give the announcement a second thought. Like I said, I was and am a sucker for this kind of stuff, and Mr. Mays was telling a story better than anything I could conjure up. I wanted to learn from this guy, even though I didn't believe much of the story. After the class had thinned a bit, Mr. Mays continued with the story. He told the remaining few that he and his friends opened the cellar door, releasing a smell that he only described as the most putrid thing my senses have ever experienced. The group was no longer concerned with finding the owners of the property, but was now set on finding the source of that smell. They went down the steps into the cellar, which was lit by single bulbs spaced sporadically along the ceiling of a long hallway. No one spoke. Things had gotten too strange. The walls were lined with metal sheeting similar to the roofing on farms. The hallway itself was crooked and the ceilings constantly lowered and rose, like a tunnel that was hastily dug and then never touched up. There were sections where the boys almost had to crouch in order to pass. The worst part, Mr. Mays told us, was that the light bulbs continuously flickered, sometimes acting like a strobe light, and making it very difficult to move through the winding and unstable hallways. In hindsight, he was certain that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he remembered seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. He said that when you're that focused on something, or if you're that nervous, your mind can do that to you. It simply can revolt, showing you things or people that aren't there. He continued to describe the hallway, and I was on the edge of my seat. The halls were windy and seemed to go on forever. Mr. Mays guessed that they were somewhere under the creepy forest they had driven through when they found a door, but he couldn't be sure. He said that they came upon a door after walking for what felt like a mile. It was simple and wooden, but it looked like it belonged outside of a suburban home. It had a nice design, seemed to be freshly painted red, and had a very nice knob and knocker on it. It was a door that belongs at an entrance to a nice house, not one that would be sitting in a dirt tunnel in the middle of nowhere. His friend walked toward the door, moving carefully because of the flashing light bulb and increasingly uncertainty about the stability of the surrounding walls. He turned to the group, the rest of which were nervous at the very least, and attempted to lighten the mood with a laugh before he said, "I should probably knock first." Mr. May's friend grabbed the steel knocker and hit it against the door several times, mockingly but quietly uttering, "Is anyone home?" The group waited about 30 seconds before their attention broke. The guy next to the door shrugged his shoulders and went to walk back to his friends, but as he did, the light bulb between them surged and exploded. The boys shielded their eyes and looked back to their lone friend by the door. As he lowered his hands, one of the metal sheets of the makeshift roof dropped. The edge of the sheet fell directly on the boy's forehead, slicing it open and sending a wave of blood down his face. The impact apparently knocked him out, and he fell back against the door, knocking it open in the process. The entirety of the group rushed through the dim light to their friend, barely noticing the seemingly pitch-black room that now lay before them. Mr. Mays was the first to make it to his friend's side. He lifted the guy's head into his arms, immediately taking off his jacket and putting it over the forehead in an attempt to stop the bleeding. Once the group had calmed down, Mr. Mays noticed that the arm that had been bracing his friend's head was soaking wet. He was confused about this, and was attempting to sort it out when one of his friends started talking. He said something along the lines of, "The lights, we gotta go," when Mr. Mays took notice. "You know, when you turn off a light," he told the class, "and everything is almost pitch black except the light of the bulb dying out or cooling down. It was like that, but there were so many of them. At least 20 light bulbs had lit the room seconds ago, and now only looked like little stars in the darkness. That was definitely terrifying, but that wasn't the scariest thing." There was still a very dim light coming from the hallway behind them, and though it was weak, it lit the room up just enough to see the shape of tens of people standing less than 10 feet in front of them. Mr. May's friend went to say something else as one of the bulbs to their right flickered to life. Let me interrupt at this point and say that Mr. Mays was a generally playful guy. He had that tone of voice that makes you want to respond. Basically, he could say, "Let's go jump off a cliff, guys," and you would want to respond with, "All right, Mr. Mays, show us the way." That is a ridiculous statement, but it gets the point across. He was a charismatic guy. The whole story, up to this point, had been told like a campfire story. He had the voice inflections of someone attempting to be mysterious and scary, which worked, but was noticeable. At this point in his tale, I recall that changing completely. He was no longer attempting to spook anyone. I could tell that this section was difficult for him. Either he was a very good actor, or it was really a terrifying memory for him to relive. He told us that the light bulb came to life and illuminated the group of people in front of him. In the dim light, he could see children, at least 20 of them, in just the visible light. They were all dressed in nightgowns that looked to be tattered and torn, stained dark with something. Their hair was long. Every single one of them looked like they had not had a haircut since birth. Some of the children were almost completely obscured by the length of it. Every single one of them didn't appear to have seen a shower or a nice bath in their entire life. Mr. Mays told us that the most terrifying part of the whole thing was that none of the children were moving. They were all standing, staring, most of them only visible from the faint light reflecting off of their eyes. His whole group was paralyzed with fear for several seconds when they heard what sounded like an animal in the distance, yelping. The way it was described was like the sound of a dog crying, multiplied by 10. This spurred the group to life just as the children began to step forward. His friends grabbed the injured one and lifted him out of the room and into the hallway in an instant. Mr. Mays took another second to move and had difficulty finding his bearings. He reached to his left in an attempt to find a wall to lean against, and ended up finding a handle then pulled hard, never losing his vision on the children. He bolted for the door right as he noticed what he had grabbed onto. A shower head protruded from a cement wall, reaching maybe a foot into the room. There was something leaking from it, but it was too dim to tell what it was. He realized that it had been leaking onto him, but he didn't care. There were now children stammering towards him as an animal cried in the distance, and his friend was seriously injured. As he left the room, he made a point to emphasize that he could make out several more shower heads on the wall near the single dim light bulb. "This is why I call them the showers," Mr. Mays told the class. I was transfixed, sitting as far forward as my desk would allow, bracing for more. "I slammed the red door behind me," he said, "and ran through the hallway faster than I have ever run before or since. I made it back to the car, and we drove out of there like a bat out of hell." A couple of students snickered at his use of the word hell. "So, when you're out trick-or-treating tonight, make sure you know exactly where you're headed, and don't go out to any abandoned farmhouses. I mean, there aren't many around here, but you're all smart kids. Well, except for Jiry." And the class laughed, and the mood lightened as the bell rang for passing period. Mr. Mays turned the light on and thanked everyone for listening, reminded them about the paper due next week, and told us to have a safe and happy Halloween. Students all around me were abuzz with theories about the story they just heard. "I bet it was some sort of crazy Nazi hideout," said one girl. "I think they were all ghost babies that were killed by a dog," said another. I couldn't theorize in the slightest. I was still caught up in the moment. The way that Mr. Mays had told that story and the detail that he included in it left me feeling like we didn't get the whole story. A couple of days later, I stayed after class and asked him about how it really ended and what happened to his friend. He laughed and said that his friend was fine and that it was, honestly, he whispered this part, probably due to some of the drugs we were on at the time. Mr. Mays winked at me as if to say, "Don't tell anybody about the drug bit, kid." And I smiled and left. I lived in that town for another couple of months and then was rapidly moved halfway across the country to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I twisted the tale around and told it around campfires as I got older, and it was always a hit, but I always changed the ending, letting the friend die of blood loss or from being dragged away by the children. It wasn't until college that I got a chance to talk to Mr. Mays again. I went to college in northern New York, not for any reasons associated with this story. College was a fun time for me. I continued being the same ham that I had always been. It wasn't until sometime around my junior year that I ran into Mr. Mays at a bar that I frequented. Initially, I couldn't be sure that the person I saw laying with his head buried in his arms at the bar was Mr. Mays. The only trait that grabbed my attention was a sweater that he used to wear on his birthday during class. The shirt simply read, "I'm the birthday boy." I told my group of friends to grab a table and that I would join them in a second, then walked over to the man at the bar. "Mr. Mays?" I said, and the man looked up. The man took a second to look at my face before he smiled, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Hey there, son. How have you been?" I could smell some strong whiskey on his breath, and his cheeks were flushed. The look in his eyes told me that he was 3 sheets to the wind and probably had no idea who I was. "Mr. Mays, it's Jack. I was a student of yours for a couple of semesters, about 6 years or so ago." His face changed a bit, and a genuine look of recognition set in. He took a calmer tone, smiled, and said, "How have you been, Jack?" We talked for a solid 20 minutes. I told him what I'd been doing for the last several years, and he told me. Apparently, he was still teaching at the same high school, the same old shtick, as he called it. I asked if everything was all right, and he said that they were as good as they ever have been and were ever going to get. It took me a while to realize that I was an adult that was having a conversation with another adult. Every time I had spoken to Mr. Mays previously, I had been in the teacher-student relationship, but now I was just a guy having a drink with a friend at the bar. My friends eventually left, and I continued to drink with Mr. Mays. He told me all about his divorce and his kids, things that I would never have asked or cared about previously, but now I cared. He was a real person to me, not just an idol anymore. This was a guy who had real problems, not the infallible teacher that I once thought he was. It had been several hours before I even brought up his story about the showers. I told him all about my history with urban legends and scary stories, and he just laughed. When I mentioned the story that he had told us years ago, he almost seemed uncomfortable. He finished his whiskey, signaled for another, and then turned at me and got very serious. "Listen, Jack, I don't know why I kept telling that story year after year." His words were slurred, or my hearing was messed up. We were both sufficiently blitzed at this point. "That was what my therapist told me to do when I was younger. I had to tell people it, to come to grips with it or some shit." He took a big swig of his drink. "Wait, your therapist?" I said. Mr. Mays laughed heartily and looked at me. "Of course, Jack. You think that something like that wouldn't fuck a person up?" I was confused, but smiled nonetheless. Things had gotten very strange. "But, I mean, you said you were all on drugs or something, right? No one was too terribly hurt. You were all okay, right?" He got almost cartoonish with his sadness in the next several seconds. "Of course we didn't, Jack. Why do you think I'm here now, right now?" I was puzzled, quickly filled with 1,000 questions that I wanted to ask him, but I let him carry on. You didn't make it, Jack." He laughed. His laugh turned suddenly to tears. "Fucking took him, they did. I didn't even know. Cops told us we were just drunk and that he wandered off and got taken by the wildlife. He didn't know. Didn't see it, Jack." I was absolutely stone-faced at this point. Mr. Mays was carrying along like I knew the actual story, but I didn't. His friend disappeared. I didn't know. "I wish they'd found the body, though. Then we could have shown them," he sighed. "It's a bad place, Jack. I don't know anything else to say. It's a bad place." He carried on for a few minutes more about his friend and the fun that they had before they went on that trip, and I let him talk. It was only a few minutes later that his phone rang. "Hello, sweetheart," he whispered into the phone. "I'll be out in a second. He gagged. "Love you, baby." The person on the other end hung up the phone, and Mr. Mays got up to leave. "It's been nice seeing you, Jackie. You got a good head on your shoulders, boy. Make sure you use it." He began to walk out of the bar. "Mr. Mays," I yelled after him. "Yeah, Jack?" He turned back towards me. "Where'd you say all that showers business took place?" "What? Hell, didn't I mention it? It's somewhere outside Broken Bow, Nebraska. Fucking hell on earth, if you ask me." Mr. Mays walked out of the bar after waving to me, running into the wall before eventually finding the door. That was the last time I'd see him. I'd never been able to tell him the impact that he had on my life, or rather the impact that his story had on me. He'd never known about the trip we took after graduation, almost mimicking the one he and his friends had made. He would never know that the things he saw at that place were real. Why? Well, he died about a month later. His liver failed on him. It's all right, though, because his family was with him in the hospital room. He got to die around the people that cared about him, And that's all you can ask for a man like that. I experienced that place too, several years later. And this is where my story turns. The following is the story of how I came to find the showers, and why I will never, ever go anywhere near Nebraska ever again. I'll finish this story when I'm sober. The memory's clear enough. Part 2. I'm awake now, semi-sober, and ready to finish this for you guys, the internet, and whoever cares to hear it. I didn't find out that Mr. Mays had passed away until a couple of months after the funeral service. Initially, I was going to seek out his family in order to send my condolences, but it wasn't as if Mr. Mays and I were best friends or anything like that, so I refrained. I continued through my college career and graduated a year or so after our bar meeting. Graduating with English as my major wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't exactly something that landed me any sort of immediate jobs after college. Now, I had saved a pretty solid amount of money while I was in school and decided that I deserved a bit of vacation, if you will. I took my spare cash, got together with my college buddy Steve, packed up and hit the road, aiming for somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. I had lived near Littleton, Colorado when I was younger, and remembered loving the area, so this destination was as good as any. The trip was a success. We made it somewhere around Estes Park, Colorado, and found a cheap cabin that we rented for about a month. The days were filled with lounging, hiking, and generally things that involved little to no work on our parts. After our rental was through, we packed up again and headed on our way back east. Sometime during this trip, we met up with a couple Estes Park natives in one of the local bars. We never typically hung out with them or anything like that. We just had conversations now and then over drinks and food. One night, these guys were paying their tab and packing up to leave awfully early. They were usually there until the wee hours of the morning. When we questioned them about it, they told us that they were headed to a little get-together with some friends of theirs, and they invited us. Having nothing else to do, we hopped in the car and followed them to the party. The party itself was very low-key, and ultimately inconsequential to this story. However, the important thing about it was that at some point in the night, we were all sitting around the fire and swapping ghost stories. At this point in my life, I wasn't as much of a ham as I was in my younger years, but with a little bit of encouragement, I started on a couple of stories that I remembered telling in my youth. Eventually, I made it to Mr. May's story about the showers. Every time that I had told it after hearing it from Mr. Mays, I spiced it up a little bit. But out of some sort of subconscious respect for my former teacher, I went straight into the version that he told my class in my sophomore year of high school. The group enjoyed my stories for the most part, the showers being the mutual favorite among the partygoers. Steve and I left for the cabin at around 5 in the morning, and he asked me about that story on the drive home. I told him all about Mr. Mays, that class, my love for everything horror-related and whatnot, and he suggested that we try to find a place on our return trip to New York. Initially, I was reluctant, simply because I didn't feel like aimlessly wandering through Nebraska for days, looking for some old farm building that was probably demolished at this point. But a couple of days before we left Colorado, I told Steve that it sounded like fun. We weren't going to be able to do another trip like this for a long time, so I figured we might as well make the best of it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought of it as a little bit of tribute to Mr. Mays, a guy that, in retrospect, helped me realize that I wanted to be a writer. Anyway, we left Colorado and made the long, boring, and barren drive to Broken Bow, Nebraska, or Hell on Earth, as Mr. Mays had put it. We found a motel in town and hung around for a couple of days, venturing out 100 miles or so in any given direction each day after that. I remembered Mr. Mays telling us that it was somewhere outside of Broken Bow, but I don't think he got any more specific than that. We tried asking the townsfolk if they had any information about the showers, but we were usually met with blank stares or eye-rolling when we told them exactly what this place was. The only person who seemed to know anything about it was an older lady that worked at a gas station on the outskirts of town. I don't recall her name, but this woman was just one of those cheerful old people, very helpful and generally interested in what anyone had to say to her. Steve had started talking to her at checkout, and she asked about our license plate, commenting about the fact that we were very far from home. We had nowhere in particular to be, so Steve and I ended up talking to this woman for about 15 minutes, at which point we brought up the hunt for the place known as the Showers. Initially, the name didn't ring any bells with the woman, which made sense, seeing as Mr. Mays had just given it the name after his experience there. But when I began to describe the details that I remembered from his story, the friendly old woman interrupted me. Her tone was not scornful or mean in any way, but she became very terse and deliberate with her words from that point on. "People don't deal with anything relating to that sort of business around here anymore," she told us. "That was all a long time ago." Following her statements, she attempted to be cheerful again, excusing herself to the restroom and wishing us the best on our return trip to New York. Steve and I returned to the car without a word. Both of us were thinking about what the lady had said. Again, she didn't seem to be angry at all. She just didn't want to hear another word about it. We were driving back to the hotel before Steve said something. "I mean, if I had to live in a place associated with an urban legend or something like that, I would totally mess with anyone who asked about it," he said. "I mean, eventually you'd just get tired of people asking about it, and so you'd just try to scare them to get them to shut up, wouldn't you?" I agreed with Steve and kept driving, but the whole experience wasn't sitting right with me. If this was some sort of well-known legend in the area, why did no one else in the town seem to know anything about it? But I managed to shrug it off. Mind you, neither of us was scared of finding the Showers. This little excursion on our road trip was more like a scavenger hunt, a cap-off to an overall relaxing vacation. Steve and I were basically like tourists, hunting for the site at which a famous movie was filmed or something like that. We went into the whole situation with little or no expectations, and a fleeting hope that we'd be able to find this place. We spent another day in Broken Bow before we took our next trip out to try and find the Showers. Nebraska isn't as terrible a place as people make it out to be, but it really isn't all that exciting. We found a bar and spent some time there, and that was just about the extent of our activity on our day off. When we did get back on the road, we decided that we'd attempt to stay off of main roads for as much of the day as we could. I knew there was no way that this place was going to be off the highway, and I remembered some detail about a dirt road in Mr. May's story, so we went looking for those. This was a fairly futile effort. Most of Nebraska is dirt roads. It was 7 in the evening when we came upon a small but thick forest. I use the term lightly, but for Nebraska, this place was like an oasis. The trees were full and thick, shrouding most of its insides in darkness. The sun was setting, and even though we had run into a few of these random crops of trees, we agreed that this one showed more promise than any of the others. There wasn't really a road, but there looked to be a path where a dirt road might have been at some point, so we drove along that. If the car was able to handle the Rocky Mountains, a dirt path in Nebraska would give us no trouble. We moved slowly and carefully along this trail, making sure to clear any fallen trees in the road or rocks that would render the car useless when the sun finished setting. It was pretty dark in this place during the day, but when night came, it was something else entirely. I had an inkling at this point that we had found the right place, but I didn't want to jinx it, so we continued onward. I didn't realize it at the time, but the little bits of light that managed to penetrate the canopy in this miniature forest actually did make it look as if the tree branches were trying to grab the car, just like Mr. Mays had mentioned in the story. I'm still convinced that he made up the part about the animal eyes, though. The most aggressive creature we saw in the woods was a dead rabbit on the side of the trail. It didn't have any obvious signs of death. It just looked like it had simply laid down and never bothered to get up. We drove around in the darkness for quite a while before we found a clearing. We had to move several smaller clusters of branches out of the way before, but right in front of our exit was a giant, dead monster of a tree. There was no way we were moving one of these, so we got out and turned on the bright headlights in the hopes it would illuminate the area in front of us. There was a feeling of excitement mixed strangely with fear when I saw what lay 50 feet beyond the clearing. There, lit partially by the headlights from the car and a little bit of light from the crescent moon, was what appeared to be an old barn house. It wasn't your typical farmhouse. It was larger than the barns that I had seen in films and didn't have any sort of crest. It basically looked like a small warehouse. I wasn't entirely sure at this point if this was the place we were looking for, but this was definitely the closest we had come. I moved through the brush until I was roughly 20 feet from the entrance, at which point all of the growth seemed to stop. I don't know if the owners had done something to the soil, but the whole structure had a border around it that was clear of any sort of plant life. I approached the entrance to the building, a large sliding door, as Steve came up behind me with 2 flashlights in hand. "So you're just going to run off into that place in the dark?" He laughed. I gave a half-hearted chuckle, and I grabbed one of the lights from his hand. Mine was little, but a pretty bright flashlight. It was the kind that hikers would most likely fasten to their backpacks, just in case they were stranded at night. It worked well enough. I grabbed the metal door with both hands, holding the flashlight with my mouth, and gave it a tug. It moved slightly, creaked a little bit, but there was no way I was going to move this by myself. Steve came up from behind, set his flashlight on the ground, grabbed the door, and said, 1, 2, 3. We pulled at the door with all we could muster. Once we managed to move it a couple of inches, it must have latched back onto the track because it slid very easily, stopping hard with a loud and echoing thud when it was completely open. Steve picked up his flashlight and walked behind me. I'd already moved inside. The inside of the structure was exceptionally bare, almost troublingly so. I wasn't entirely sure how far we were from the nearest home or small town, but there wasn't even the slightest bit of evidence that anyone had been in this building for years. There were no broken beer bottles or empty bags of chips. There weren't even any animal droppings or eager plants that managed to grow here. The room was expansive, larger than your average farm, but not the warehouse-sized monstrosity that I believed Mr. Mays had described in his story. I was sure that it was simply a holding area for farm equipment or something similar at that point. Disappointed, I wandered near the entrance while Steve ventured into the expanse of darkness. As I was running over the details of the story in my mind, something struck me like a sack of bricks. In Mr. May's story, there was a silo near the barn. I ran outside, my eyes adjusting easily because at the very least it was brighter outside. I looked in all directions, running around the perimeter of the building. Surely, if there was ever a silo near this place, there would be some evidence of it somewhere. But despite my hopes, there was nothing but a cluster of thick bushes on one side, brush and dirt everywhere, and the forest that we had come from. I walked back into the building, frustrated and tired. Steve was still excited, eagerly running around the inside of the building. "Even if we could just find a shower head or a pipe," he said, "then we'd know it was true. Just keep looking with me." I didn't want to ruin his excitement. I had told Steve the story several times, but obviously he didn't realize that this just wasn't the place. The building was weird, yeah. It was out of place and oddly pristine, but it wasn't the location of the showers. I let him explore for a little bit before I called him over. "This is probably as close as we're going to get, man," I said. "But this isn't it. Remember the silo?" His face went from excitement to disappointment in an instant, much like a young child who didn't get the presents he wanted on his birthday. I patted him on the shoulder. "This is still pretty cool, though. I mean, we could still tell people that we found it." I was reverting back to my old habits quickly. Steve laughed. "Yeah, man, I guess we could. It is definitely creepy enough. We should get some pictures as proof, you know." I agreed with him. I'm going to go grab the camera real quick. And he bolted out of the building entrance. I was left alone in the building. It was very quiet when I was alone in there. I could hear the faint sound of Steve running through the brush and out to the car, but once he was far enough away, everything was quiet. I remember not even hearing wind or the chirping of crickets as I walked deeper into the dark, flashlight in hand. I was convinced that there had to be something. As I approached the far corner of the room, the sound of my feet scratching against the dirt was interrupted by a soft, hollow thud. I stopped, trying to figure out what it was. I put my foot down hard against the ground and heard it again. I stomped one more time, realizing that the floor that I was standing on was covering something hollow. I walked to the wall of the room, looking carefully at the floor to try to spot any holes or gaps. As far as I'd known, it was solid ground that this thing sat upon, so I was convinced that I had found a hatch or a basement or something. I heard Steve coming back through the brush as I shouted, "Steve, come on over here, it's hot." As I went to say the word hollow, I hopped off a little bit, hoping to recreate the sound so that he'd be able to hear it upon entering the door. The second that my feet made contact with the floor, I felt it give out beneath me. The memory of the fall is fuzzy, but I do recall hearing wood splinter. I remember seeing the light from Steve's flashlight falling away into complete darkness. It wasn't a long fall, but I must have fallen in a terrible position because I know that I lost consciousness for several seconds at least. When I woke up, I was staring at a bright light. For an instant, I had thoughts about approaching the fabled light at the end of the tunnel. I was angry at myself. You died in Nebraska, Jack? Wow, you do know how to fuck up. My self-deprecation in the afterlife was interrupted by what sounded like Steve's voice. "Jesus, Jack! Jack! Can you hear me? Dude, wake up! Please, wake up!" I managed to lift my head up off the floor just enough for him to celebrate. The pain in my head was immense, but it was outweighed by the pain shooting through my knee. I knew I had a concussion, but the pain in my knee was just so much more pressing. I looked around until I found my tiny flashlight, then sat up and reassured Steve. "I'm okay. I just hurt my knee. I bumped my head, too, really hard." "Thank fuck, man. I thought you were dead. Imagine that, though, dying in fucking Nebraska. It'll be awful." His words made me laugh a little bit, but I stopped myself. The slightest shaking hurt my head and made me incredibly dizzy. "I guess a rope," said Steve. "What?" I asked quietly. "Should I go get a rope to get you out of here, or do you see a ladder?" I looked around the walls that sat in front of me. They were smooth cement. There was no way that I was climbing out of here. "Yeah, get the rope," I told him. "It was buried under all of our stuff. I think it might be in my red climbing bag, but I'm not sure." Steve nodded, telling me to hang in there and that he'd be back in a little bit, and then he ran off. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. After the sound of Steve's feet scraping the floor above me faded away, I was only able to hear that buzzing that occurs in total silence intertwined with the pulsing in my head. I pushed myself over to the nearest cement wall and braced myself against it, resting and breathing deep in an attempt to calm myself. The cement was unnaturally cold against my back. It was summer, so I only had a t-shirt on, but it felt like ice even through that. Again, this observation was primarily made after the fact. In the moment, it just felt good to lean against something. I sat there, waiting for Steve in this underground basement, and I began to feel uneasy. I felt like an idiot for falling down here. I felt pain for my injuries as well. That all seemed to fade into one emotion in an instant when I heard what I could only identify as breathing. Somewhere to my left. I convinced myself that it was my injured mind playing tricks on me for a few moments, until my mind decided to rapidly replay Mr. May's story. When I'd first heard it in that classroom years before, I was more impressed than I was scared. But now, sitting in a dark basement in the middle of Nebraska, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. It couldn't even be summed up in the word fear. As I sat there, I felt all-encompassing dread. I pointed my flashlight to my left, the direction from which I thought I heard the sound. The light didn't reach the other wall, it was too far away, but I was comforted to see absolutely nothing there. I breathed deeply for a couple more seconds before I heard another noise in the darkness. It was very quick, and I cannot be sure that it wasn't my own body moving around without my noticing, but I thought I heard a scraping sound not 10 feet in front of me. It sounded like the noise your feet make when you're walking across a dirt-covered floor. Before I could react, I heard the breathing to my left again, closer this time. There was no way this was real. I hadn't seen so much as a spider web in this building, and now I was convincing myself that something next to me was breathing. I was angry at myself for getting so worked up. I told myself that the human brain is constantly hallucinating. I told myself that while in silence or darkness, the brain will make sounds to fill the gap or make you think you see things that aren't there. I channeled my inner skeptic in order to calm myself. It worked. It worked until I saw a flash of something in front of me. I can't be entirely sure what it was, but I heard the accompanying sounds of feet scraping against the floor, and I began to swell with dread. I decided that the best course of action at this point was to turn off my flashlight, assuming that if they couldn't see me, they couldn't get to me, whatever they might be. I turned off my flashlight and was left in complete and total darkness. The bulb of the flashlight faded as it cooled, and I put it into my pocket, simultaneously pushing back against the cold cement wall in an attempt to stand. I managed to get up on my foot, and found that I couldn't stand to put any pressure on my injured knee. I limped to the corner, humming to myself, trying to break the deafening silence. I called for Steve as loud as I could manage, but heard no response. He was probably in the back of the car still hunting for the rope. There had to be a ladder or something somewhere. I continued to hum, and my heartbeat, which had been beating almost out of my chest, slowed to a manageable rate. I moved along the cement wall, keeping my whole body against it, and the weight off my injured knee. I had traveled what I guessed to be 10 feet when my head made contact with something in front of me. I tumbled to the ground. My concussion must have amplified the pain because it was blinding. I reached both hands to my forehead when I felt something warm and wet with my fingers. I searched for a cut anywhere on my forehead, but couldn't find one. I desperately searched for my flashlight as I sat up and tried to get back against the wall. I grabbed the light in my right hand, bracing against the wall with the other. I turned it on and pointed it into the darkness where I was just laying. The floor was wet, but the dirt had muddled the color of whatever the liquid was. I tried to get my eyes to focus on the puddle, tried to convince myself that it was my blood when I saw another drop fall into the puddle. Words lacked the ability to describe the way I felt when I heard the drip noise again, and saw yet another tiny ball of liquid fall into the puddle. I think I knew, even then, exactly what the source was, but I was endlessly trying to convince myself that I was wrong. I lifted the flashlight up and pointed it at the source of the liquid. What stared back at me was a pipe that protruded at least a foot out from the cement wall. The metal was rusted and cracked. Little bits of the liquid began to seep from them. At the end of the pipe was a simple shower head, aimed down towards the ground. You know that feeling when your stomach drops? In this case, I think mine literally did, because I vomited immediately. I got it all over my shoe, but that was the least bit important at the time. I ignored the pain in my knee and shuffled along the wall as fast as I possibly could. I heard noises, but I can't be sure if it was just the sounds of my own movement or something around me. I managed to duck under the next shower head. This one was higher up in the wall and seemed to be leaking the same liquid that the other one was. I felt like I was moving along something infinite. Every now and then, I would have to duck or move under another metal bar, another shower head. They began to pour more profusely, but the liquid was too thick to come out easily. The room began to smell. I remembered immediately the way that Mr. Mays had described it. I grabbed my shirt and put it over my nose, trucking onward, but it didn't stop the smell for an instant. It smelled like vomit. It smelled like shit. It smelled like burnt hair. It smelled like rot. I was still moving against the wall when I fell into some sort of outlet. I hit the dirt ground hard, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The pain still managed to break through, though. My flashlight was still in my hand. I aimed it and examined my surroundings. Sitting in front of me was a doorway. There was a door there, though it looked aged now. It had a nice little design on it, a doorknob and a knocker that looked like a snarling demon. Red paint was peeling from it, flaking off and falling to the ground in front of me. I clumsily rose and bust through the door, narrowly missing a piece of hanging sheet metal in front of me. I was crawling now. There was no way that I could run. The walls and ceiling were lined with metal, the kind that you would see on the roof of a farm. Large pieces of wood seemed to brace the sheets, holding this makeshift tunnel together. I couldn't risk sliding against that and possibly cutting myself on the metal or hitting the wood and causing a cave-in, so I crawled. I pulled myself for what felt like miles, running into walls every now and then because the path seemed to curve like a snake. I had no idea where I was in relation to that hole that I had fallen through, but I told myself that there was an exit at the end of this. Had I not been crawling, I would have surely hurt myself far worse. There were parts of the tunnel in which the ceiling dipped down to maybe 3 feet above the ground. It hadn't caved in because the ceiling still lined it. Someone had built it like this. This again is in hindsight. I didn't care at the time. I kept telling myself there was nothing behind me, but I swore that I heard feet scraping only a few inches behind my own. My jeans would brush against my legs every now and then, making it feel like someone was touching me, and even now, I still can't completely convince myself that someone wasn't. I crawled and crawled until I reached an upslope. With joy, I looked ahead of me. There was a cellar door. The door was made of wood. I knew this because I could see light through them. I couldn't be sure, but I thought it might have been the light from the car's headlights. Besides all of that, I was just so immensely happy to find an exit. I crawled all the way to the door and threw my shoulder into it. It budged, but it didn't open. I began to scream, but my throat seared with pain. The most I could manage was a harsh, crying noise. It sounded like a dying animal. I collapsed in exhaustion and pain, my eyes staring up at the slits of light before me. I was so close to being out of here, I could taste it. It was in that moment of silent defeat that I heard a noise that was, without question, something moving in the tunnel. It sounded like something was being dragged across the floor. It would move, pause for a second, and then move again. I had nothing left in my stomach to throw up, but I began to gag. I gathered myself slightly and tried to steady my hand enough to focus the flashlight into the tunnel. What I saw, I still cannot rationalize. I know what I saw, but I cannot convince myself that it was actually there. I can't stop telling myself that I was hallucinating. I saw a child in a dirty sleeping gown. The gown was stained with something dark and brown, with occasional splashes of a deep red. The child was extremely pale, like the pictures that people might see of a Holocaust victim. I could only make out one eye, brightly reflecting the light of my flashlight. In between huge tufts of long, dirty hair, I reached down beyond the fingertips of the child, which were caked with dirt. The boy, or girl, not entirely sure which, moved toward me with difficulty. He wasn't breathing hard. But it seemed that every movement of every muscle took every ounce of strength the child had. The thing that froze me, though, was the eye. It was only visible because it was reflecting my flashlight, but even in that glint, I could feel anger or deep hatred or something like it. This is the point in which the English language really lacks the right words to explain the situation. I could tell that this child meant me harm. Whether it was a hallucination or not, the thing was getting closer. I started to cry. It was getting closer and closer when I heard a voice from behind me. "Hey, Jack," whispered the voice. It was Steve, I was certain. I tried to talk back, fully intending to say, "Open this up and get me out right now." However, given my current state, I am sure it just sounded like garbled nonsense. I crawled at the door, pushing against it with everything that I had, and finally breaking eye contact with the child. As I did this, the flashlight rolled down the slope, coming to rest somewhere near the child's feet. "What do you see?" the voice asked. "What are you talking about?" I closed my eyes. I remember hearing a reply along the lines of, "Just look at it, tell me what you see." But my own screams of frustration drowned it out. I was mumbling like a maniac when the voice told me, calmly, "Rest for a second, I'll get it." The statement took a second to settle in, at which point I closed my eyes tight. "Steve, just do it, please. Please, just get it open, please," I whimpered. "Just get me out of here." My voice was beginning to get louder. "Steve, goddammit, open the fucking wooden door." I opened my eyes for a split second to see nothing but black hair dangling in front of my face, a small glint of light hidden in the mess of tangles. I slammed my eyes shut and screamed with every ounce of energy I had, "Open the fucking door!" The door behind me gave way and I fell onto the dirt, taking in a breath of fresh air. The eyes were still closed, but the first thing that I did was scramble to find the cellar door and close it. Once I had done that, I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. I saw the barn in front of me, illuminated by the headlights of the car. My head was pulsing with pain. I was covered in dirt and liquids that I didn't even care to know the origin of. My knee was, at the very least, dislocated. But despite all of that, I was out of the tunnel. I took a deep breath, buried my head in my hands, and said, "Steve, why didn't you just fucking open the door?" I waited for a response, but none came. "Steve, seriously," I began. "I was fucking clawing, screaming for my life," I said as I looked behind me. My stomach must have been on the verge of falling out of me at this point because it shifted again. The only thing behind me was the large mass of bushes that I had seen while examining the perimeter of the building. I was angry. "Steve, this is not the fucking time. Come out of the fucking bushes." I was getting ready to stand up when I heard a yell from the front of the building. A flashlight bobbed up and down in the semi-darkness. Steve was running into the open door of the structure, yelling my name and telling me not to worry. I must have lost consciousness at that point. When I woke up, Steve was standing over me, desperately trying to wake me up. His words were almost incoherent, at least to my ears. He helped me to my feet and began to walk me to the car. As we walked away, I saw my flashlight sitting there just outside the cellar door. The light was fading. Steve brought me back to the car and then drove me to the nearest hospital. I fell asleep, but he told me that he drove around for an hour before he found a main road. I don't think I ever told him the whole story. I believe he thinks I was just injured from the fall. He never really asked me about it, and we didn't stay in contact for much longer. It's not like we deliberately parted ways. We just sort of stopped hanging out after that trip and went our separate ways. I've never been able to fully understand what happened that night. There are many things that I can explain away as being hallucinations, but there are still many things that don't make sense. The shower heads were there, and they were leaking something. The door was real. The tunnel was real. Most everything else can be semi-rationalized if I can convince myself I had a very bad concussion. A very, very bad concussion. But the one thing that I couldn't have imagined was that cellar door was locked, and then it suddenly wasn't. I am still as skeptical as I've ever been, but I believe in what happened to me at the showers. I'm not a hermit or a social retard because of this. I drink a lot, but I'm still functional. But I will never return to Nebraska. No one will ever be able to convince me otherwise. I don't watch horror movies either. There's absolutely nothing entertaining about being so desperately scared. That's it, really. There's no typical ending for my story. I was just changed by my experience. Yeah. But there is no way to change anything about it or fight back against it. I can't even convince myself that I wasn't just seeing things. Believe me, I have been trying for years.
Home from the Sea by William Meikle. The Irishman's in trouble. It was no night to be out on the water, but it was an unwritten law in Trinity. If one of us is in trouble, we all are. I drank down the shot of rum I had but left the ale where it sat. The sea was going to be rough enough without having sour beer rolling in my gut. I went with the crowd to the dock and peered through the wind and spray. "How far out?" someone asked. "Just past the Narrows, floundering, can hold on the port side. We'll need 4 boats at least." The long rowboats normally took 8 men, but we had to leave room for bringing the Irishman and his crew, if need be. We set out 5 boats with 4 men in each rowing hard into a headwind and swell that threatened to send us as far back as forward with every stroke. It wasn't the first time I'd been out in such conditions, but it was the first attempt at rescuing a big whaler such as the Dubliner. I knew they'd been out for 3 weeks and guessed they might have even had a catch aboard. Their weight, the weather, and the sheer number of crew loomed large on my mind. I tried to ignore the increasing pain and tiredness from rowing, but I knew it was only the start of the evening's trials. By the time we reached the Narrows, we were all spent. Matters weren't helped much when the lead boat capsized. They were too far away from us to help them, but I saw clearly enough that all 4 men made it ashore. The men clambered up to the point and waved. I knew they had a long, wet walk ahead of them to get back to the warmth of a tavern. But I couldn't waste time worrying, as I too had to fight the waves and crosswinds that threatened to send us towards the same fate. I was so busy concentrating on keeping us upright and moving forward that I was nearly thrown from my seat as the prow hit something hard. I turned to yell an oath at the other sailors, but my words were lost as I looked up and saw the massive bulk of the Dubliner looming over us. I helped Roberts and Gallagher, 2 old friends, tie our boat to the Dubliner. We helped the other 3 boats so that we were all arranged in a line along the keel on the starboard side, protected from the wind. Then I started to worry. I expected someone topside to acknowledge our presence. Instead, all I heard was the whistling wind and the crashing of the waves.
"Ahoy aboard!"
Roberts called out. He had a bellow like a foghorn. We waited for a reply, but none came. Nothing good had happened on the whaler, and I wasn't at all sure any good was going to come out of us investigating further. But as the saying goes, if one is in trouble, we all are. When Roberts clambered out of the rowboat and head onto the Dubliner, I was second in line, with Gallagher at my heels. As I climbed, I steeled myself for the sights to come. I'd seen plenty of men smashed to no more than broken puppets by the fall storms, and expected that more of the same fate awaited us on deck. I climbed over the gunwales and stood beside Roberts. The deck laid empty, save for a large whale carcass on the platform at the stern. My fears of finding human corpses were allayed, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut as I realised we were going to have to search the vessel. The deck lurched beneath us as the boat was caught in a larger swell. For a second, I thought we were going to have to tumble over the side, but the keel righted itself. As the Dubliner steadied, more men came up from the rowboats. When there were more than a dozen men on deck, Roberts organised a search. I went with Gallagher and Roberts. We headed for the crew's quarters, while the others went to search the engine room, the mess and the cargo holds. 4 men worked on getting the vessel moving again, planning to get her at least through the Narrows to quieter waters in the sheltered bay. As we walked the deck of the rocking ship, silence fell on us like a blanket. Several oil lamps hung overhead at regular intervals, providing a modicum of light. The lamps cast bands of shadows that seemed to cavort and caper, leading us deeper into what I feared would be our own doom. Descending a flight of stairs, my legs felt like jelly. Every fibre of my being wanted to flee back to the tavern to get as much rum as I could get inside of me. But for the presence of Roberts and Gallagher, I might have allowed myself to succumb to the terror. My fear of ridicule was stronger than the fear of the unknown, so I followed Roberts as we went deeper into the boat. The Irishman's cabin was empty, save for a bottle of rum on the sideboard that shouted at me as I turned away to the corridor. When we stepped into the next cabin, I wish I had listened. We found our first corpse. At first I was not entirely sure what I was seeing. It looked as if someone had left a pile of clothing on the floor. Then I saw a slimy trail of blood. It led to a 6-inch wide strip away from the clothing, across the floor, then up the wall to where it stopped at the open porthole. As I bent for a closer look, it became all too obvious that what was left was little more than a sack of skin and bones. I couldn't take my eyes off the sight. I had no idea what could have done it. I only knew that I did not want to meet the culprit. "I know that jacket," Roberts said softly. It's Edward Malone. Roberts was right. It was Ed, or rather, what was left of him. A fierce drinker, a born seaman, and a man who would fight you as quick as look at you. "There's another one here," Gallagher shouted from out of the corridor. We found more remains at every turn, but no indication as to the cause of death. We only saw more bloody trails, most of which led from the bodies to outside of the vessel. "What the hell happened here?" Gallagher whispered. Neither Roberts nor I had an answer for him. The silence was broken by a scream from above, and a yell of pain and suffering that tore at my heart. We headed topside at a run. We arrived on deck to a scene of bloody chaos. Men ran and screamed, blood flew, the wind howled while the vessel bucked and rolled beneath us. All around, beasts slithered, too fast for the eye to follow, only being still where they had affixed themselves to some poor sailor. On first sight, I took them for octopus or squid, for they had sucker-laden tentacles that they had used to cling to their prey. The tentacles were attached to a head the size of a man's clenched fist. But no squid I've ever seen had a face like that. Their eyes were the worst black pits that seemed to go all the way down to hell. The pits that sat above a mouth made of an elongated tube of muscular tissue that pierced the victims' bodies and fed. The moist, sucking noises reached us even above the howling wind, and that sound was the most terrible aspect. The beasts were everywhere, 6 men had already fallen, and 3 more feebly tried to keep the ravenous creatures away with little success. Gallagher jumped at the nearest one and tried to drag it off its victim. All he succeeded in doing was tearing a lump of flesh away from the poor man's chest. The creature writhed and squirmed in Gallagher's hands, tentacles quickly circled his wrist and started to squeeze. "Get this bastard off me!" he shouted. Roberts obliged, but was more circumspect in his approach. He ran below deck and came back with an oil lamp. "Turn your head, man," he said to Gallagher, then spilled hot oil onto the beast's face. The black eyes popped, flesh slowed away, and the creature fell to the deck. Gallagher stomped on it until it was little more than jam. Another man, I'm fairly certain, was McGinnis the stoker, ran past us with one of the things clamped on his face. He went over the side without a sound. I ran to the rail to look. The sea below seethed, filled with the squirming, writhing tentacles of the beasts. I saw 3 men bolt for a rowboat. They were caught and quickly became food for scores of the creatures, their tentacles waving as if excited by the kill. The beast seemed to know I was watching. 6 heads turned, black eyes staring up at me. Then they moved as one, scrambling up the hull, coming straight for me. If the Dubliner had not lurched at that precise moment, I would have been taken, for I was so transfixed on the creatures I could not move. But when the deck tilted, Roberts dragged me aside.
"To the stern, man,"
he shouted.
"and pray the lifeboat is here."
We ran, even as the things clambered up over the gunwales and came after us. Gallagher, Roberts and I were the only men still standing by the time we had reached the stern. The sight that met us made me fear that I was not going to outlive my old mates by very long. The sperm whale, the Dubliner's last catch, seemed to be the source of the infection. Its belly was vastly swollen and distended with a gaping hole in the blubber, and a nest of beasts all fighting escaped from within. Our path to the lifeboat was blocked by the slithering mass. "We can get to it from below. Come up from under," Roberts said. The thought of being trapped below decks with the creatures filled me with dread, but I knew that Roberts was right. It might indeed be our only chance of escape. First, we had to find a safe way to get below, and that in itself was no easy task.
"We need to get off this boat,"
Gallagher shouted. Neither Roberts nor I disagreed, but the beasts blocked our way in every direction, and some were beginning to close in on us. I considered diving overboard, swimming for it and hoping for the best, when Roberts kicked and stomped at any beast in range. They burst with moist squelches and lay still. "The heads are their weak spot. We can make it," Roberts said, pointing to the hatch leading below. "Just keep kicking." We moved quickly across the deck, frantically stomping, leaving a trail of slime and mucus behind us. One of the beasts wrapped its tentacles around my ankle and squeezed, sending a flare of hot pain up my leg. I brought my heel down hard and the head popped. The tentacles fell limply away. I dived through the hatch after Roberts. Gallagher was behind us, screaming. Roberts and I furiously pulled the hatch closed. Just as he fell through, one of the beasts was attached to Gallagher's shoulder, biting into him, making him scream louder. To the man's credit, Gallagher moved like someone who wasn't ready to lie down and die. He yanked the thing away, tearing out a chunk of his own skin, and threw it. The creature hit the wall, fell to the floor, and with a wet thud, and started scurrying back. Roberts lunged forward and brought his boot down on its head until it finally lay still. We stood there, covered in blood and slime, staring at each other. All around us, the Dubliners seemed to be alive. It swayed softly, the wind echoed through hollow corridors. But worst of all, the slimy skittering made the ship sound as though it had lungs, and we stood stupefied in the belly of the beast. Suddenly, all was silent, save for the creaking of the old boat and the distant roar of the storm. At some point in the melee, I lost my bearings. I thought we had descended to the area immediately above the engine room, but we were once again in the corridor that led to the crew quarters. And if the layout of the whaler was as I remembered, there was no easy way to get to our objective. Our situation has hardly improved, Gallagher said quietly. He bled heavily from the wound in his shoulder, but waved me away when I tried to help. I'll have time for doctoring later. I looked to Roberts for guidance. He bent over the remains of the creature at our feet. "What the hell are they?" Gallagher asked. "I'd never seen the like before." "Never heard of the like either," Roberts replied, wiping slime on his trousers. "It's some kind of squid, but I'm buggered if I know anything more than that. Besides, what they are isn't important. We need to get to the stern and fast. The boat is going into the rocks at any minute, and when that happens, we're all dead anyway." I wasn't too keen on being reminded of that fact. I looked down the corridor at the path we had to take. Even with the presence of oil lamps, it was too dark to see more than 10 yards. My imagination filled in the blanks only too well. I started in that direction, but Robert had other ideas. "We could go further down," he said. "The most direct route is through the main hold." "But we have no idea what might be down there," Gallagher said. "Can't be any worse than what's above," Roberts replied. He lifted one of the oil lamps off from its hook on the wall, "and the sooner it's done, the quicker we can get off this ghost ship." I followed Roberts closely, hoping his last statement was close to the truth. We found the Irishman at the foot of the steps. The creatures had gotten him, but not before he had taken many of them with him. Charred remains lay strewn in a wide circle around the captain's body. A hole in his chest showed how he had finally succumbed. It hadn't been long either, for the firebrand in his hand was still warm. "He had the right idea," Robert said, lighting the brand from the flame in the oil lamp. "We should have thought it ourselves. See if you can find more of these." I knew from experience that a supply of brands was often kept near the entrance to the hold in whaling vessels. I found 3 long ones and passed one to Gallagher. Then we lit up from the one in Robert's hand. We had enough light to see that we hadn't just found the Irishman, we found most of his crew as well. They tried making a stand. Some corpses lay hidden behind barrels and crates, others were piled at the foot of some stairs. Bloody, slimy trails led away from each of the dead and faded into the darkness of the ship. The boat swayed hard, threatening to throw us off our feet. In a corner, a sea beast scurried away. I expected Roberts to quickly head for the stern, but he and Gallagher had eyes only for the cargo. I saw that the hold was almost full. The whaler had made a profitable trip. The barrels sloshed as the boat rolled, each I assumed full of whale oil. "There's a king's ransom here," Gallagher whispered. "We've got to try and salvage what we can." Roberts laughed bitterly. "What we need to salvage is our lives." Gallagher wasn't convinced, but he followed as we made our way through the hold. I jumped at every shadow, every creak of warping wood as we went forward. When the attack came, it came from 2 directions. I turned towards the sound to see the tentacles reaching for my face. I grabbed the brand and hit the head square on. Something hissed, and the air filled with a stench that made me gag. Hot spew rose in my throat. I saw that the creature was burned badly. One of the black eyes had popped and dribbled noxious fluid onto the deck. Before I could lift my foot to stop down, it lunged at me again like a coiled snake. I poked it twice with the brand, and the flames took on the second attempt. The head went first. Tentacles writhed and thrashed in a frenzy until I brought my boot down hard. Behind me, Gallagher and Roberts sounded as though they had troubles of their own. I turned to my crewmates. They had not had my good fortune of hearing the attack. A second burning beast was on the deck. Roberts was still on his feet, but white as a sheet, apart from where a wash of blood ran down his chest, a gaping wound at his neck, evidence of where the thing had penetrated his throat. "I'll be fine," Roberts whispered. A moment later his legs gave way despite Gallagher trying to hold him up. He fell at my feet, dead eyes staring up at me. Gallagher headed forward at a flat run. The ship's breathing grew harder and more intense, the swaying increased, and the slimy movements all around reinforced the illusion of lungs. I got to the stairs that led up to the stern just in time to see Gallagher step onto the deck some 12 feet above me. I flinched, expecting him to be immediately attacked, but all I heard was the whistle of the wind and the roar of water on rocks. The vessel struck something hard enough to make me lose my footing and drop the brand. It hit the deck, snuffed out and rolled away. Somewhere in the shadows I heard another beast move. I fled up the steps, praying not to be hauled backwards down into the dark. Gallagher took no notice of me. He stood staring towards the shore. The lights of Trinity twinkled in some quarter of a mile distant. By some miracle, we had made it unscathed through the narrows and were being propelled towards the main harbour. "We can bring her in," Gallagher said. "Salvage the oil. We can be rich men by the morning." I was tempted, and I saw it in my mind's eye, the taverns and the whorehouses overrun by these sea demons, burrowing into drunken flesh, feeding on babes, and the old alike taking the town by storm. I could never allow it. The look on Gallagher's face said that he was lost in greed with no thought for the consequences. I did the only thing I could think of. I cracked him in the jaw as hard as I was able. To my relief, he fell out cold. Gallagher's a big lad, but I wasn't able to manhandle him onto the rowboat easily enough. I left him there, took up his firebrand, and made my way back down into the hold to do what needed to be done. It was dark. Every sound, every shadow made me jump, but the fear of what might happen to my town drove me forward. I kicked over the nearest barrel, then another, and two more, before one finally obliged me and split open, spilling oil. The skittering sounds grew louder, but the beasts did not approach. I managed a grim smile as I put brand to oil and the deck blazed in flame. I fled upward, fire nipping at my heels. A creature threw itself down at me from above. I caught it by the tentacles, slung it around my head and tossed it into the flame. It took some layers of skin from my hands it left, but that was a small price to pay to see it burst open in the fire. The first barrel blew as I reached the main deck, the concussion almost knocking me off my feet. The vessel shook and lurched sharply to port. I had a bad couple of seconds when I couldn't find the winch for the lifeboat, and only released it just as a second explosion nearly tore the whaler in half. I fell, my stomach in my mouth, the boat hitting the water hard and almost overturning before I was able to get an oar in my hand. Gallagher woke, groggily unawares of what had happened. Then his eyes burned with anger when he saw what I had done. But the anger quickly turned to terror as the sea between us and the rapidly sinking vessel began seething and roiling. A mass of tentacles rose as if tasting the air, seeking us out. Scores of the creatures had escaped the ship and they were making straight for us. "Row, you bugger!" I shouted, and Gallagher thankfully didn't argue. 2 more explosions racked the stricken whaler, then a third, huge blast that filled the air with smoke, splinters and ash. When I could see clearly again, the Dubliner was gone, save for a mass of wreckage bobbing on the water. The tentacled beasts swam fast and were mere yards from overrunning us. I gripped the oar, meaning to use it as a club, ready to take some of them to hell with me. And that's when the sound came from out beyond the Narrows. It was a high wail, like the one we had heard from the creatures earlier, but deeper, resonant. It sang out like a great church organ, high and clear, even above the roar of the wind. The swimming beasts stopped, their interest in us suddenly gone. Scores of mouths opened, the feeding tubes raised high out of the water. As they too wailed, answering some distant call, the noise from beyond the Narrows grew louder, more insistent. The beasts started swimming again, not towards us, but off towards the Narrows. "Oh my God, it's huge," Gallagher said. We rowed to the shore in silence. We wouldn't speak of what we saw again, not until later in the warmth and comfort of the tavern. "It filled the whole of the Narrows," Gallagher whispered, so no one but I could hear, chilling me once more to the bone. Their mother called them home.
Burial at Sea. Written by The Itch. Narrated by Jeff Clement. I awoke to find myself not in the comfort of my bed, but instead encapsulated in a tiny dark space. All around me was warm and black. Immediately I was overcome by the overwhelming panic of claustrophobia. I thrashed about in the tiny dark space. I smashed my hands against the top of the enclosure and clawed the walls. I writhed in agony, in terror. I could feel the hotness of my hyperventilation caught in the space in front of me. The temperature of the air in my tiny prison increased from my paroxysms. Calm down, 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 calm down. Breathe, breathe. In, and out. Get a hold of yourself. Stop. Think. Don't panic. I started to panic. The claustrophobia rose again like a balloon in my chest. Oh God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die. No, no. Stop. You're not gonna die. Calm down. Calm down. You're not gonna die. You're wasting oxygen because you're hyperventilating. And if you don't get a hold of yourself, you're definitely going to die when you use up all the air. Okay. Stop. Slow down. And breathe. Assess the situation. I'm alive. I'm trapped in a small space. Okay, feel the space out. I tried to raise my arms up as far as they could go. I had 4, maybe 5 inches above me. It was awkward, but if I crossed my arms in front of my chest, I could still bring them up to my face. I scratched my nose. I reached out the other way. I had about the same amount of leeway in the horizontal directions. 4, maybe 5 inches at most extending out from my body on either side. I turned my wrists over and pushed my palms flat against the wall in front of me. It was solid wood. I could feel the grain. The panic started to rise in my throat again, and I pushed it down as best I could. In and out. Breathe. I tried to think back to the last thing I could remember. Everything just got fuzzy and disjointed. Trying to take even a short jaunt through short-term memory was like wading into a thick fog. The last thing I remembered was going to bed with my wife. But that seemed like days ago. Maybe weeks. Now I was trapped in this warm, claustrophobic blackness of unknown origin or purpose. I ran my fingers along the edges of the box. There was a carved lip on the walls of my prison, and a segment jutting out from either side of the piece above that rested on them. It seemed like a puzzle that had been assembled with me inside. And then I started to realize the truth. I ran my fingers along the coarse grain of the wood once more. I touched the sides and ran my one thumb along the top edge of my tiny box once more, just to be sure. Yes, there was no mistaking it. I was in a coffin. Whoever, whatever, had done this to me had abducted me out of my ordinary life and thrown me into a box meant for the dead. I was buried alive. Time passed. I drifted in and out of consciousness. I thought of what I had read about U.S. soldiers going over to Iraq and how they tested their mettle with sensory deprivation. Depriving the human body of sensory input was enough to cause it to try to fill the void. All of the participants hallucinated within a very short period of time. Auditory, visual, tactile. No sense was excluded. I was starting to feel that way now. All I had was the blackness of the coffin, the feeling of my warm breath, and the feel of the unsanded wood beneath my fingers. I was in a coffin. My breathing was under control now, but I began to feel the panic slowly rising in my chest once again. I was in a coffin, buried alive. Only the air in the box to breathe and no way out. No way out. No way out. No way out. Before my mind could spin up into a panic any further, I was snapped back to reality by everything shifting. I felt it Unmistakably, the coffin had shifted down and to the left, and then slightly back to the right. How could the earth shift in such a way? I lay still in my prison, and I listened to the sound of my breathing, and I felt the warmth of my exhaling in front of me. I could feel it now. The coffin was shifting ever so slightly back and forth. There was a slow, rhythmic oscillation to the box I was entrapped in. How could this be? My anxiety and claustrophobia were pushed aside by my mind racing for answers. I was moving, but why? How? I took a step back mentally. What did I remember? Nothing, really. What did I know? I was in a coffin, yes. That much I could ascertain from my sense of touch and the rough wood around me. But I had merely assumed that I was buried alive, 6 feet under, deep within the earth. I was encased in blackness and had only my sense of touch to go on. All that I could take in was the walls of my tiny prison. As I felt the rhythmic swaying, slowly rocking my universe, my mind was cleared by a startling realization. Holy fuck! I was underwater! The oscillation I felt was the coffin swaying in the liquid around me. Could it be? How? Who? Why? What would snatch me from the night and not only wipe my memory, but bury me within a coffin, not deep within the earth, but in the depths of some body of water? I knew only what I surveyed within my prison and what I could feel. If I was, in fact, submerged, I could be in a small tank or at the bottom of the deepest ocean. There was no way for me to tell. I had to be sure. I shifted as far as I could in the tiny space and slammed the weight of my body against the side of the coffin. The loud thunk of my body connecting with the wood was followed by a gross sense of disorientation as my environment swayed wildly back and forth and threw me against the enclosed walls. The amplitude of the pendular motion attenuated and my prison stabilized. Well, that settled it. I was underwater. A prison such as the humble one I found myself in now would surely rise to the surface due to the air inside. Surely my weight was not enough to keep it submerged. My casket could not be weighed down, otherwise it would not be free to shift as it just did, or with the periodic motion of the water around me. I could picture it now. Not only was I imprisoned in a casket underwater, but also chained to a point on the bottom, suspended but floating free. Oh fuck. I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I clawed at the coffin again, wildly. I writhed in the tiny confines that were now my universe. Slowly, sense overtook me again, and my breathing slowed. I felt the gentle currents of the ocean rock the coffin back and forth in a long, gradual motion. It was almost calming, in a way. If my mind wasn't so focused on my mortality, I would have found it relaxing. Almost soporific. Okay, now what did I know? 1, I was trapped in a coffin. I banged my palms flat against the board above me. Yeah, there was never any doubt of that. 2, I was most likely, if not surely, underwater. 3. The gentle rocking motion that I felt almost surely meant that I was in the ocean, or some other large body of water. I could feel myself getting tired. Soon I would be lulled to sleep by the gentle rocking of the ocean and the thickening warm air, which was growing ever more oxygen depleted with every breath I took. What were my options? Not many. Crying for help would do no good. Could I dig my way out? With what, Sherlock? I felt in my pockets for my keys, but they were gone. Could I smash the coffin? Surely whoever went to all the effort of abducting me, encasing me in it, and suspending it from the ocean floor would also make sure it was sturdy. Once more, I thrashed in the coffin. The lid above me would not budge. It had the weight of the entire ocean above pressing down upon it. When I hit the sides, I felt them give a little. The wood was soft. I could feel it. It is a well-known but little considered fact that the average person possesses far more strength in the legs than the other parts of the body. This is why it's always so silly to see an action hero in a blockbuster film attempt to break down a door with his shoulder. This will only result in frustration and some very bad bruising. As any SWAT team member or well-trained police officer will tell you, the most effective way to break open a locked but unbarred door is to place several well-aimed kicks right at the lock set. Which is why the tight feeling of dread and impending doom in my chest was briefly replaced by a warm feeling. A feeling of hope. I was still wearing my heavy work boots. There was barely any room within the confines of the coffin to draw my leg back, but I had to try. I brought my right leg up as far as I could and to the side a little where there was space. The soft wood gave a little under my kick. Now the left. I felt the wood flex and the vibration shake the rest of the coffin beneath. God damn it, I was gonna do it. I was gonna live. I was going to fight my way out of this stupid box or die trying. I kicked with my right again, harder. The wood gave a little. Again, the left. I could feel it weakening. I began to kick wildly at the bottom of the coffin in rapid succession. The exertion energized my body to a fever pitch. I shouted nonsense now and screamed as I thrashed and kicked at the bottom. Pain rose in my legs. I couldn't keep this up much longer. I'm not gonna die, 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 I'm not gonna die. I stopped kicking and panted. A slow trickle. I kicked once more, still panting. I heard another crack, shorter and lower this time. I felt an icy cold wetness against the bottom of my calf. Water was pooling in the bottom of the coffin. Water was pooling in the bottom of the coffin. I had cracked the board and now the box was slowly filling with ocean. If I didn't break the coffin apart instead of suffocating to death, I was going to drown. The pain in my legs still burned, but I steeled myself and brought down my heavy boots against the bottom of the coffin again. More trickling, louder and faster now. The sound of water streaming into more water like someone taking a piss. God damn you to hell, you fucking bastard! I'm not gonna die like this! I brought both legs up as far as I could and kicked out with the last of my strength. And heard a final deep crack. I gasped one last short breath, and then there was the sound of rushing water and the coffin imploded. Everything after that happened very fast. Shock as my body was surrounded by cold and wet, the lid coming down and striking my head. All was black. All was cold. All was wet. I pushed the lid as hard as I could and felt it taken up by the water. I put my arms up above and felt no resistance. I was free. I couldn't see, but I pulled myself up in the water. I kicked off my heavy work boots and pulled and swam through the blackness in what direction I could only assume was up. My lungs began to burn. Still I pulled, still I kicked. I pulled, and the blackness around me began to give way to gray, and then to fingers of moonlight dancing in the water above me. Hope rose in my chest. I pulled. So close now. Lungs burning. At last I breached the surface of the ocean and felt cold night air against the salt water in my face. I did it. I was alive. Alive. I was awash in euphoria. Waves of my elation joined those of the sea. I had done it. I had escaped. I looked up into the beautiful full moon and felt more alive than I'd ever felt. I smiled a giant smile and breathed the cold, fresh air of the sea. I looked down from the sky to see the gentle rolling waves of the ocean illuminated in moonlight. All around, I saw only the ocean, stretching out to the horizon. A perfect plain, extending off into infinity in all directions. I was adrift at sea. I missed the warm blackness of the coffin.
Chilling tales for dark nights.